advanced weapons, including surface-to-air missiles. The UN further discovered that al-Shabaab had sent over a dozen operatives to Yemen for training, including in the use of weaponized drones. The training is already paying dividends. The African Center for Strategic Studies notes that al-Shabaab has demonstrated greater drone deployment capabilities in its 2025 offensive, which has the Somali government on the back foot. Meanwhile, the Houthis have benefited from al-Shabaab's extensive maritime networks and experience with smuggling to ensure that they get weapons and supplies. This expertise has become essential to the Houthis as Iran attempts to rearm its proxies in an increasingly hostile region. A report from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace claims that, quote, Somalia's porous coastlines have become critical to ensuring that the group has access to Iranian supplies necessary for the growth of its drone and missile program, end quote. However, the support extends beyond just smuggling and into something more direct. According to New Lines magazine, Somali groups may have played a direct role in Houthi attacks on shipping. The UN found that 1/3 of attacks in the Gulf of Aden took place outside areas the Houthis can monitor with their current radar capabilities. The implication was clear. Someone else was guiding the strikes. Somali fighters perhaps operating supplies necessary for the growth of its drone and missile program, end quote. However, the support extends beyond just smuggling and into something more direct. According to New Lines magazine, Somali groups may have played a direct role in Houthi attacks on shipping. The UN found that 1/3 of attacks in the Gulf of Aden took place outside areas the Houthis can monitor with their current radar capabilities. The implication was clear. Someone else was guiding the strikes. Somali fighters, perhaps operating from remote stretches of coastline, may have been directly involved in scouting targets and relaying coordinates. Ibrahim Jalal, a regional security expert and co-author of the Carnegie report we quoted earlier, believes that the Houthis deployed coordinators to help facilitate this cooperation. An underappreciated consequence of the closer relationship between al-Shabaab and the Houthis is that it has given Iran an opportunity to develop its strategic depth in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. With the axis of resistance functionally hobbling along on one leg, Iran needs all the friends it can get, especially if those friends look to be on the verge of victory in Somalia. And while Somalia is dealing with the most immediate impacts of this alliance in a resurgent al-Shabaab that's greedily gobbling our territory, it won't stop there. This isn't just about a couple of terror groups shaking hands over smuggled rifles and drone schematics. We are witnessing the evolution of insurgent logistics into a transitional shadow economy that, if left unchecked, poses a massive security risk to the region. What's to stop a confident al-Shabaab armed with drones from launching large-scale attacks on Kenya or Ethiopia? What's stopping an emboldened and rearmed Houthi force from attacking more ships? The UN estimates that they make almost $180 million a month from illegal safe transit fees. What's stopping them from charging more? So, what can we do? Well, for you watching this at home and me recording this in my studio, not very much. But for regional governments and their international partners, the clock is ticking. Because here's the kicker. Even if the Houthi and al-Shabaab alliance were to fall apart tomorrow, the infrastructure they've created won't just disappear. The smuggling routes, the logistics hubs, and the training networks will be absorbed and repurposed by the next insurgency that crops up. Persistently lawless, unstable Red Sea and Gulf of Aden is highly disruptive to international security and the global economy. Egypt is already suffering, losing more than $6 billion from reduced Suez Canal crossings. European companies and consumers are bearing the brunt of increased shipping times and higher prices. Maritime security cannot keep being a nice-to-have that countries only deploy when things get hairy. Instead, it must actively work to disrupt these networks before they mature. If it doesn't, then what we are seeing in Somalia will become the blueprint for the next generation of asymmetric threats. Decentralized, ideologically flexible, economically self-sustaining. In other words, insurgencies that don't need to win hearts and minds because they already control supply chains and revenue streams. A deepening alliance has been emerging in the Middle East. Some segments of the Druze community, a little known found themselves in headlines after Israel took the unprecedented step of bombing Damascus, not to stop Iranian weapon stashes or to destroy military assets, as is often but allegedly to enter into ways of using the legitimate attack. The catalyst for such a move began unfolding in Syria's Suwaida province. What started as a loot Bedouin communities exploded into systematic slaughter. The Bedouin clan kidnapped and robbed a Druze man on July the 11th, igniting tit-for-tat attacks between the two communities. Following patterns established during Syria's civil war, Druze militias responded by taking their own Bedouin hostages to force a prisoner swap. The Bedouins retaliated, and soon both sides setting up armed checkpoints and launching attacks, including more what if the neighbor-on-neighbor violence escalated dramatically? Bedouin militias began dragging Druze back from their cars and executing them on the roads. When Syrian government forces were dispatched across the border, they ended up largely making the situation worse, with mass executions in town squares and sexual assaults live-streamed on social media. The death toll spiked to 150 to 200. The segments of Syria's government forces increasingly explicitly and lethally siding with the Bedouins. Damascus would later claim these to be extreme elements operating alongside the mandate. This was the second time in the last several months that rebels integrated into government forces and carried out sectarian massacres. While it doesn't appear they were directly ordered to do so by Syria's new leader, al-Sharaa, it nevertheless reveals just how weak the new government is in controlling its own forces. By July 16th, Israeli Jews had seen enough. Hundreds gathered at the Majd Shams border crossing and did something extraordinary. They broke through the security fence into Syria. Here's what happened next, according to eyewitnesses quoted in The Insider. The soldiers at the fence, many of them Druze themselves, stepped aside. Some were crying. Open the gates. Let us through. End quote. Around 200 Israeli Druze poured into Syria, desperate to reach relatives under attack in nearby villages like Ada. Some brought medical supplies, others brought weapons. The scene disappeared into chaos. Israeli citizens inside hostile Syrian territory with a mini war going on. Several managed to evacuate wounded relatives back toward the border, while others took up arms alongside Syrian Druze defenders. This created something of a crisis for the Netanyahu government. Israeli citizens were now in the middle of a Syrian firefight, but sending idea of ground forces to extract them would mean invading Syria, potentially triggering a war. Meanwhile, the violence carried on, assaults on Druze and their inevitable reprisals. Netanyahu's solution was both dramatic and calculated. Rather than risk a ground operation, he decided to use airstrikes to force the Syrian forces and Bedouin forces to back down. Within hours of the border breach, Israeli F-35s were striking toward Damascus. Their strikes were devastating and symbolic. Missiles slammed into Syria's defense in the surrounding part of the capital. Additional strikes hit near the presidential palace. Netanyahu went on television that evening with an unprecedented declaration. Israel would protect, quote, our Jews brothers. States, but that declaration from Netanyahu is precisely what makes these strikes so different. Why would Israel take such an effort, fresh off its confrontation with Iran, when it depleted its air defense reserves considerably? Well, according to Israeli defense sources, the June confrontation consumed approximately 40% of Israel's interceptor missile stockpiles, with production struggling to keep pace with usage. Furthermore, common in the region. So, what makes this so important for Jews? Well, the answer lies in understanding who the Jews are, who they are to Israel, and what protecting them is. You see, the Jews are a small ethno-religious minority, 1.2 million worldwide, who broke from Islam about 1,000 years ago. They're largely concentrated in the land split between Syria and significant minority shares in Lebanon and Israel. Within Syria's Druze community, there are significant divisions. Some leaders sought negotiated solutions to the recent violence, while others advocated for armed resistance and explicitly called for Israeli intervention. Inside of Israel, they have a long, unique relationship with the government. Since 1997, Druze men, unlike other Arab citizens, have been subject to the IDF. This created what both sides call a covenant of heavily invested in Israeli security. Country and a military pact with them. That sentiment explains why, when violence erupted in Suwaida province, Israel's response was so swift. But this isn't just about historic loyalty. Recent Hamas attacks demonstrated just how integral the Druze have become to the country's defense. Druze soldiers were some of the first responders racing to respond to Hamas fighters that day. For Israel's security establishment, the Syrian massacres presented both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis was obvious and immediate. Israeli Druze were not going to stand by while their relatives were slaughtered. Their deep integration into the IDF meant that this wasn't just public pressure, it was pressure from the both in terms of the military as well as the fundraising. Druze officers, some at the highest levels, advocating for intervention. The opportunity was more strategic. Syria's new government, led by former Islamist rebels who toppled Assad in December last year, was already viewed suspiciously by many Israeli politicians, although there had been rumors of warming relations, including the potentially groundbreaking move of Damascus joining the Abraham Accords. While not fully verified, this was widely reported on and something that is quite clearly off the table at this point. Regardless, there wasn't exactly a ton of love lost between Jerusalem and al-Sharar's government. For many, the fighting served a purpose independent of the Druze, as one Israeli defense official told Haaretz on the condition of anonymity, quote, "Look, we're not naive. Protecting the Druze is the right thing to do, but it also sends a message to the new regime in Damascus. We're watching, and we can reach you anywhere." End quote. And those strikes next to Presidential Palace, well, they're starting to look a little bit more strategic, aren't they? Israel has a vested interest in sending such a message to Syria's new government, given their historically volatile relationship. Since its founding in 1948, Syria has been among Jerusalem's most consistent enemies. Damascus has fought in every major Arab-Israel war and has never signed a peace treaty like Egypt or Jordan. But with Assad gone and former rebels in charge, the only thing certain lately has been uncertainty. The new Syrian leader, al-Sharar, has been ambiguous at best as to just how reformed he is, given the extensive connection to Islamic extremism in the past. His government faces the enormous challenge of integrating various rebel factions, including some with histories of sectarian violence, into a unified security force, a process that has clearly shown its limitations in Sueda. For the Syrian Druze themselves, Israeli protection is a double-edged sword. Yes, it's safe from immediate massacre, and may offer some protection against mass slaughter going forward. Syrian forces withdrew from Sueda. The US had broken a ceasefire by July 16th, with Damascus promising to respect Druze communities. But Damascus has very weak control over its own territory, another issue with the new government. The Sueda incident is neither the first nor likely the last such sectarian explosion. Just months earlier, in March 2025, Alawite villages on the coast were massacred by extremist fighters allied with the new government. Over 40 killed in a single day, according to human rights monitors. There is confusion over which side started shooting first. The slaughter of innocents has proven that al-Sharar's promises of respect and peace mean little more than the paper they're written on. The Syrian state, still consolidating power after Assad's fall, can barely control its own militias, let alone providing protection to minorities scattered across the country. But it's also remarkable as collaborators in the lives of many neighbors. Druze leader Walid Jumblat has already warned his community against becoming pawns in Israel's games, and stands in association with Israel will be dangerous in the region. The Druze have always walked a tightrope in the Arab world. While they shared cultural traditions with others, their secret faith, which includes belief in reincarnation and doesn't accept converts, essentially an ethno-religion, has made them perpetual outsiders. Aligning too closely with Israel, especially toward the Jewish state, is an increasing risk of being targets of violence. The challenges are also mounting for Israel, which has recently been facing more hostility on the global stage than at any time in recent memory. France has recently declared it will recognize a Palestinian state, with rumors the UK could follow. Even Netanyahu publicly has begun to criticize Jerusalem over the humanitarian catastrophe that is evolving in Gaza. For now, the message has been sent. Attack the Druze at your own risk. This wasn't purely Israel saw an opportunity to demonstrate its reach, test Syria's new government, and satisfy domestic demand in its own Druze population all at once. The Druze have solidified a powerful ally, but in a region where sectarian violence is something of a norm, and only a small minority of Druze actually live inside Israel's borders, just how safe they are remains an open question. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Welcome back to the Situation Room, where we explore how the global pandemonium of today becomes the global pandemonium of tomorrow. First up, we're heading to Myanmar, where a shadowy autonomous state that's one part Wagner Group, one part Hezbollah, has lent its services to China amidst an ongoing war. Then, we'll head over to the African Sahel, where just weeks after Russia's Wagner Group left the nation of Mali, the regional security situation is worse than ever. From there, we'll move over to Colombia, where an attempt on a presidential candidate's life and a major terror attack suggests that the country's security situation might be unraveling rather quickly. And finally, we're going to address reports that the Islamic State is reconsolidating in Iraq and Syria, getting our weapons, activating sleeper cells, and getting ready for all-out war. You can find timestamps on the video or in the description, but really, it's all pretty fascinating stuff, so stick around. And also gives me that watch time, doesn't it? Cheers. First up, let's go to Myanmar to revisit a rapidly evolving situation covered in the recent past. A couple of weeks ago, we presented a statement on China's involvement in Myanmar in its Situation Rooms, published on June 9th. Explained China's willingness to bend both sides in Myanmar's civil war to its will in order to protect its own financial and economic interests. To summarize the situation in the simplest possible terms, China couldn't care less about who wins the civil war, but China cares oh so very much that neither side destroys the infrastructure that China has worked so hard to build across Myanmar. But although that general premise is basically unchanged since we presented that earlier episode, new developments coming out of Myanmar have put a spotlight on China's secret weapon inventory. That would be the self-governing village of Laos, a functionally independent government in Myanmar's east. Divided between two mountainous, secluded patches of territory, our state is home to about 3/4 of a million people living as part of a one-party communist regime with its own civil authorities, its own military, even its own language. For all practical purposes, our state is disinterested in the exchange of sovereignty or recognition on the world stage. It openly accepts Myanmar's claim of sovereignty over its territory, while its self-administered status is recognized in Myanmar's constitution. Instead, the two chunks of land that make up our state, one on the border with China and one on the border with Thailand, are functionally a Chinese vassal state. Our state speaks predominantly standard Mandarin. It relies on Chinese goods, cell service, and currency, and arms itself with weapons supplied by Beijing. It also is mostly bountiful natural resources, especially tin and rubber, which China extracts largely for its own benefit in a comfortable and mutually agreeable arrangement with our state. Right now, China's in a bit of a tricky, but potentially lucrative position both in Myanmar and on the global stage. In Myanmar, it's managed to get the nation's ruling regime and its many rebel groups to respect Beijing's authority and its interests, but it's limited in its ability to expand its interests without sending its people or assets into the crossfire in other areas. In broader geopolitics, China is working to establish dominance over the United States and the global West when it comes to mineral resources, especially rare earth metals that it can use as a bargaining chip during trade wars negotiations and long-term power struggles with the United States. And according to exclusive reporting by Reuters, our state appears to be China's answer to both of these problems. Normally reclusive and reticent to leave their own territory, our state's armed forces have recently taken up positions around rare earth mines in Myanmar's east. Those mines harvest a range of critical minerals that are vital for producing wind turbines, electric vehicles, and more, and the rare earth metals that China sources from Myanmar are of paramount importance. According to China's customs division, almost half of the rare earth metals and materials that China has imported thus far in 2025 have come from Myanmar, making them a very important part of China's rare earth monopoly. Lose control over those mines, which would risk other nations establishing rare earth supply chains that start in Myanmar and sneak those resources out, right under Beijing's nose. In the last several months, China has been particularly concerned about control over these mines after fighters loyal to the captured Chinese army groups seized a band of mines that are the source of nearly half the heavy rare earth metal production on the planet. At the time that the captain took over those mines, Chinese imports of rare earth compounds from Myanmar fell nearly 90%. 80%. According to sources on the ground speaking about the Kachin mine captures when they took place in late 2024, the group had intended to coerce China into cooperating with the broader rebel movement. After all, if the Kachin could throttle China's access to rare earths, especially by leveraging the caches and captured weaponry to defend it, then China might decide that it was easier for them to make a deal with the rebels than to try and win the mines back by force. The Kachin even put direct pressure on China by hosting officials from Indian rare earth mining firms to explore the possibility of setting up a relationship. But the Kachin would ultimately fail to lay down the law against China in the way that they probably hoped. Rather than giving in to Kachin's terms or intervening directly in the conflict, China turned its attention to other deposits that ended up in mine. You see, although the assets that Kachin controls make up half of the world's rare earth production, that only accounts for a portion of rare earth deposits that are actively being mined. Myanmar is known to have immense untapped reserves that are exploited or China new mining operations tapped into the deposits and surged Chinese nationals into the area, harvesting minerals around the clock. Deficit. Those miners, those trucks travel about 200 kilometers to the Chinese border, and there they are processed. But rather than put its own troops on the ground, China has chosen to leverage military assets loyalty to our state, with the mounted US army now providing direct security over China's operations. That's a very convenient situation for China. It prepares not to station its own troops abroad unless absolutely necessary, and it has only recently started deploying mercenary outfits similar to the Russian Wagner Group. In this case, War State is a far cleaner option for China, taking advantage of manpower and military hardware that's already available in Myanmar, leaning on the group's significant fighting forces, and letting War State soldiers do the secret dirty work involved with protecting China's interests. Faced with the situation in China simply was the problem they've created and moves to set up operations that are directly control the Kachin. War State is a fair match for the battlefield, if not a good deal more dangerous than the Kachin are, and the Kachin have their own problems to deal with in the fight against Myanmar's military regime. Not only that, but the idea of cutting off China's supply lines is a far less dangerous prospect than attacking Chinese interests, something that the Kachin almost certainly know is a horrible idea. With not just extraction operations, but Chinese nationals on the ground in Myanmar, an assault on the new mines by the Kachin could prompt China to take decisive, unilateral action, and that is a battle that is only going to resolve one way. Now, getting its fix without Kachin involvement, the rebels are locked into a financial game with China, where Beijing can control market prices, throttle the Kachin's ability to export, keep foreign investors out, and otherwise diminish the potency of the Kachin's new economic weapon until it is ground down. And then there's the implications for War State itself. China's growing involvement in securing mines outside their own territory has shown an increasing weakness of their enclaves. Recently, War State has started placing its troops in sensitive areas, including the city of Lashio, at times when China has forced the handover of that territory from Myanmar's rebels to its military regime. The handover of important strategic targets is a subject that we've explored in depth in the prior episode, but the fact that War State is now showing up in places like Lashio to pressure the rebels represents a significant change in the way that War State operates. The foreign government is militarily powerful when compared to other non-state factions in Myanmar, equipped with relatively high-end weapons in a place where many rebel groups largely with single-shot hunting rifles until very recently. War State is rumoured to have surface-to-air and surface-to-surface missiles. It's known to have armoured fighting vehicles and howitzer artillery, and it's rumoured to even have possessed military attack helicopters at one time, although they don't appear to be flying any helicopters. But the war-based fighting structures and 30,000 active duty troops, often constantly conscripted from families to fight for the regime, and their numbers, plus their equipment, is more than a match. Historically, they've been looking to avoid trouble factions, but if China is directing them to more actively take part in guarding Beijing's interests, with the war now acting as security guarantors for China outside the confines of War State itself, they've opened up a whole range of possibilities for China to guard its assets amidst the chaos of the civil war. from a massive pipeline that would allow China to receive oil despite a hypothetical wartime blockade, to lucrative gold mines, to major Chinese business interests in Yangon and Mandalay, there is a lot of Chinese capital tied up in Myanmar with both economic and strategic implications. If war can prove capable of locking down China's new rare earth mining operations, then China may start to ask, what else? Perhaps they could send a few hundred troops here to watch over a security pipeline while a battle rages nearby, or maybe there to secure majority Chinese neighborhoods when the rebels push into important cities. And if Myanmar's military and its rebels prove as willing to attack the war directly as the council have, the war could turn into even more security force. Proving the ordinance of Chinese interests in a conflict where the risks posed to Chinese interests can determine who lives or dies. If China can establish a secure mining belt under the War State Army's protection, it could potentially siege even more weapons, establish even more mines, setting up Chinese and extraction operations that are nearly so vulnerable to the rise and fall of a civil war. As for what that means for Myanmar's larger conflicts, it's kind of hard to say. Perhaps if China puts confidence that it can protect its own interests and rely on a mutual understanding with all sides is less interested in preventing new rebel offensives in order to keep things stable. Or perhaps China realizes that it can safely impose more direct control over Myanmar and decides to see just how firm its grip on the country can get. Either way, China's decision to rapidly step up mining operations in Myanmar and to allow the state to do it would suggest that more change is coming in a conflict that's transformed from a struggle for self-determination into a resource war. From the thick jungles of Myanmar, we move to the arid badlands of African Sahel. Specifically, we turn to the ongoing crisis in which an Al-Qaeda-affiliated jihadist insurgency group Yemen is making greater and greater gains. Less than 2 weeks ago, we put out a standalone episode on what happened at the time, the most recent developments. Since then, the situation across the Sahel is growing even more dire. In case you might not be familiar with the broader situation, we'll give you a brief outline, although that prior episode does have plenty of supplemental information if you'd like to check it out after you finish this video. Now basically, Janim had been running wild across the Sahel for quite a while, with many of the region's nations dealing with attacks. But three in particular are in the crosshairs: Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. All three are led by military dictatorships that were established in the last few years, and all three have disengaged from security guarantors in the global west in favor of closer alignment with Russia. But over the last month and a half, Janim has rapidly escalated its rate of attack, killing several hundred soldiers across the three nations in May, and then launching an asymmetric offensive centering on Mali in June. Hundreds of Malian soldiers have been slaughtered. Janim has attacked the capital city of Bamako and the major city of Timbuktu with impunity, and after years deployed in the nation, Russian-backed paramilitary Wagner Group made a hollow declaration of victory and then fled. In the wake of the Wagner Group's departure on June the 6th, control of Russian operations in Mali shifted over to another paramilitary group known around the world as the Afrika Korps. Unlike Wagner, the Afrika Korps is openly and transparently under the direct control of Russia's Ministry of Defense, even though it isn't a formal member of the Russian armed forces. The Afrika Korps was to unload a new group of paramilitary fighters into Mali, take over operations from Wagner, and get back to work as a military regime, as well as the other regional governments that Mali considers its allies. In the process, the Afrika Korps was not expected to take quite as prominent a role in combat as the Wagner Group was known for, but it would instead move into a more direct support, training Malian soldiers, bolstering and protecting supply lines, and presiding over the security situation in important zones of arms front lines. But almost as soon as the Afrika Korps deployment began, Russia's new paramilitaries were swept up into the chaos of the Sahel conflict. Within just their first 2 weeks deployed, around 10 Afrika Korps fighters were killed, at a minimum, in 2 separate attacks via roadside improvised explosive devices and an ambush on a convoy. Other reports suggest that Janim may have already brought down an Afrika Korps helicopter. In addition to their direct personnel losses, the Afrika Korps proved unable to intervene as Janim set roadside bombs in the capital. Elsewhere in Mali, Janim attacked multiple mining camps where Chinese nationals oversee the extraction of valuable mineral resources, killing multiple Chinese weapons in the process. And in Burkina Faso and Niger, Janim has attacked military bases with just 2 days, inflicting casualties each time, and in one case, Now, on some level, for a likely due to the difficulties in setting up shop in an active war zone. Far less accustomed to the operating environment than Wagner, it's not inconceivable that Afrika Korps fighters may have been more easily targeted or might have been exposed to procedures that Wagner wouldn't have made. But at the same time, it was certainly an inauspicious start for the paramilitary group in a moment when Mali is in urgent need of an upgrade beyond what Wagner had been able to provide. Not only that, but Afrika Korps fighters lack the local connections, the friends in Mali's military and government, and the relationships with ethnic militias that have been able to cultivate over several years of work across the country. The Afrika Korps does include large numbers of former Wagner fighters, but it doesn't appear that those are the same fighters who were in Mali before simply transitioning to work under a new banner. Instead, these appear to be ex-Wagner fighters with the deal to join the Afrika Korps following the takeover in Mali has continued. Reports from Russia's defense apparatus suggest that Wagner's may have been coming for some time. According to some of Russia's online mill bloggers, the plan to replace Wagner has been underway since the start of the year, sending new military equipment in months in order to make ready for the Afrika Korps' arrival. That said, it does appear that Wagner left sooner than expected, possibly in response to the wave of attacks perpetrated by the Kremlin in early June. That departure appears to have been a case of the Kremlin ushering them toward the door a bit quicker than originally planned, instead of kicking them out of a nation where they had no idea they'd be leaving. That would indicate that Moscow has greater confidence in its Afrika Korps than it does in remnant Wagner elements, but it's not clear that Russia should feel so confident. With the security situation in Mali deteriorating this quickly, the decision to remove fighters who are comfortable on the front lines and replace them with advisors who seem less willing to get their hands dirty is a significant gamble. Not only that, but Russia will no longer be able to simply write off its losses on the battlefield as easily as it did with its nameless, faceless mercenaries operating in a legal grey area. And while the world basically knows what the Wagner Group is at this point, that ability to avoid reporting setbacks still goes a long way for Russia on the home front. If the hope was for the Afrika Korps' lower profile and distance from combat to mean that fewer setbacks would happen, well, Janim appears to have proved that assumption oh so wrong. The news of a more carefully planned departure for the Wagner Group comes on the heels of reporting that Wagner may be pushed out of the other African nations as well. The most significant among them is the Central African Republic, where Wagner is very well entrenched and, by some accounts, practically runs the country through a puppet government. For a while, reports have circulated that the Russian Ministry of Defense wanted to uproot Wagner from the CAR, but that the nation's president pushed back, insisting that his personal bodyguards and a number of top Wagner advisors be allowed to stay. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Wagner fighters in the CAR are something of a special case, highly influential in the timber and gold trades, and immune from many of the same orders that other Wagner elements have been forced to sign with Moscow. But all indications are that Moscow is continuing its push to remove Wagner from the CAR, potentially even agreeing to a deal for a massive Russian base that the local government has wanted to host to guarantee its own security since at least 2019. If uprooting Wagner from the CAR is worth the effort from Moscow's perspective, then Wagner's other remaining deployments across the continent probably aren't going to last long. Meanwhile, all indications are that Janin is gathering strength at the same time that it's expanding its profile even further across the African Sahel and West Africa. According to one recent report by the New York Times, Janin is working its way into nations that were previously thought to be safe, like the Ivory Coast and Benin, where they'll find a large crop of impoverished, ideologically flexible young men who may be eager to join their ranks. With American and European financial and military support for the region waning, border controls breaking down, even for relatively secure nations, jihadists seek treatment in the Ivory Coast for battle wounds sustained in Burkina Faso and rustle cattle or even kidnap people from the Ivory Coast before retreating into Burkina Faso. As the jihadists continue their attacks in the region, it is impossible to miss a wave of attacks slowly working its way south toward the ocean, now straddling the border between the chaotic, landlocked nations of the Sahel and the northern portions of West African nations with southern coastlines. And back in the three military regimes of the Sahel, ruling governments aren't able to stabilize their own centers of power, let alone help to relieve a growing crisis for their southern neighbors. In Mali, General Assimi Goïta was granted a mandate for another 5 years at the head of the regime in legislation passed just a few days ago. Goita has recently dissolved political parties and disappeared pro-democracy advocates, while at the same time starting to work on a gold refinery that's being built in partnership with a Russian conglomerate and nationalizing a gold mine previously under the control of the Canada-based Barrick Corporation. While those decisions have been presented by Goita and his regime as a necessary step to strengthen Mali's government and gain control over its own mineral resources, the underlying reality is very clear: that the Malian regime is far more interested in self-enrichment and gathering power than it is in addressing the jihadist crisis that's harming Mali's people. Recently, the government in Mali has been forced to formally recognize local agreements between some of its own rural communities and the Jenim insurgency, with those communities pledging not to cause trouble for the jihadists, and the jihadists in return deciding not to massacre them. In Burkina Faso, the news is heartbreaking. Traoré is rapidly building a personality cult as his army takes hundreds of losses at a time. In Niger, recent small-scale attempts to increase terrorist financing have fallen far short of what's required to make a difference, while the government continues a broader standoff, despite both nations sharing a very dangerous course. This move by crisis-plagued Nigerians to re-engage diplomatically with the three military-led governments might seem on its face as if it's an opportunity for regional collaboration, but neither Nigeria's government nor its security forces are ready to engage in meaningful intervention. At the time of writing, it may appear as if the military governments in any of these three nations are on the brink of collapse. Mali seems to be the closest, but still has some way to go, while Burkina Faso's capital is somewhat secure, and Niger's appears to currently be stable. But between Jenin's relentlessness, its growing ability to operate all across the wider region, and the rather underwhelming potential of the cause and difference, secure capitals do not equate to winnable conflicts. Instead, each of the Sahel's regimes is consolidating its political authority and turning its attention to Russian-sponsored resource extraction operations at a moment when Jenin has a advantage in the open countryside. These three nations aren't on the precipice of turning completely into a caliphate, at least not yet, but they are in danger of being blinded by greed and complacency, while Jenim and its allies take over most of the landscape. Under these circumstances, with time and secure lands to prepare for the massive influx of fighters from down south, Jenim would create the conditions to attack major cities and even capitals. If these Sahel nations continue to miss their opportunity to step up, they may only realize how badly their situation is evolving when it's already too late to turn things around. A mere 9 years ago, it was celebrated as a success story, a model for conflict-prone regions across the globe. In 2016, the Colombian state signed a peace agreement with its largest rebel group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as FARC. In return for political representation and land rights reform, the leftist guerrilla group agreed to disarm and demobilize its roughly 30,000 combatants. At that time, it felt like negotiators had done the impossible. The conflict between FARC and the state had lasted over 52 years. At its height, guerrillas were present in almost a third of all of Colombia's territory, and while smaller rebel groups like the National Liberation Army, or ELN, still remained, there was hope that they too could be negotiated with. But for the first time in over half a century, Colombia might finally know peace. Fast forward nearly a decade, though, and those dreams seem to be in the process of crumbling. A spate of recent attacks have brought violence on a scale not seen all over the country. There's a sense that a hard-won sense of security is fading. As the Council on Foreign Relations recently wrote, quoting, "Colombia is facing its most severe security crisis since its 2016 peace accord." Now, the trigger for these rising feelings of insecurity are absolutely legion, but most can be attributed to three major events that have taken place since January. The most infamous of these is one you probably know. On June the 7th, Conservative Senator Miguel Uribe, who was campaigning in Bogota as part of the early run-up to next year's elections. The likely nominee of the Democratic Center Party, Uribe was shot in the head by a gun. At the time of writing, he remains in extremely critical condition. For outside observers, the assassination attempt had eerie echoes of Ecuador's 2023 presidential election when anti-corruption candidate Fernando Villavicencio was murdered at the capital, a killing that eroded the growing power of Ecuador's cartels. But for Colombians, the shooting of Uribe likely brought back memories closer to home. Between 1986 and 1990, 5 presidential candidates were assassinated. As The Economist noted, the June 7th shooting, quote, is the most serious act of political violence in Colombia in 30 years. If the assassination recalls the darkest days of the Civil War when drug cartels, leftist guerrillas, and far-right paramilitaries all fought one another in the state, then what happened next replicated the sheer chaos of those times. 3 days later, on June the 10th, a string of 19 coordinated gun and bomb attacks shook the southwestern city of Cali and its surrounding areas. At least 8 people were killed and 75 injured during 5 hours of terror. While some have attempted to draw a link between the two incidents, the fact is that the motive behind Uribe's shooting remains a mystery. The Cali attacks, on the other hand, have already been blamed on FARC dissidents who refused the 2016 peace deal and now operate under the name Central General Staff, or EMC. But while the more recent attacks have left a bigger mark in the public imagination, perhaps the worst display of violence so far at the very beginning of 2025. In January, the far-left ELN launched an offensive against rival FARC dissidents along Colombia's northern border with Venezuela. So intense was the fighting that some 20,000 civilians were forced to flee their homes. At the height of the ELN's operation, in February, the city of Cucuta was forced to impose a 48-hour curfew on its population of 1 million people as ELN fighters attacked local police stations with assault weapons. As The Guardian described the carnage, quoting here, the conflict between rival armed groups had spread to a regional capital, and the city's residents said they were not witnesses since the cartel unrest of the 1990s. Now, we could go on, highlighting the January outbreak of violence between armed groups in the Amazon that killed 20 people, or how ELN placed thousands of civilians in the Chaco region under a forced lockdown for 3 days. The wider point, though, is that while Colombia is no stranger to incidents like this, the sheer volume that unfolded across 2025 so far is remarkable. And while we're not yet at the point where Colombia has returned to anything near the levels of instability seen in the 1990s, there is a feeling that the country may be sliding back towards a cycle of violence that could see a scale. The figures seem to bear this out. Since 2021, kidnappings have risen by 70%. The number of armed factions has jumped since 2022 from 141 to 184, while the Council on Foreign Relations records that the recruitment of children by armed groups has spiked 1,000% since 2021. Then there are more anecdotal episodes that haven't yet made it into the official figures. Episodes like the jumping grenade attacks carried out in Bogota, which had killed 30 by April, or the killing of 27 uniformed police officers in just 2 weeks this spring, which BBC Mundo suggested was the result of drug cartels like the Gulf Town deliberately targeting off-duty law enforcement. To be clear, this is still a long way off from the seen in the 80s and 90s. After falling to a 42-year low of 24 homicides per 100,000 people in 2017, Colombia's murder rate has stayed stable-ish at 26.2 per 100,000 in 2022, before falling to 25.4 last year. By way of comparison, Ecuador's murder rate has skyrocketed its declaration of turnaround conflict, reaching an ungodly high of 44.5 per 100,000 in 2023. So, Colombia's not quite on the same trajectory as its southern neighbor just yet. That said, there are multiple signs that things are heading in the wrong direction. And that all brings us to the really obvious question of why? Why, 1 decade on from a peace process that won then President Juan dos Santos the Nobel Peace Prize, promises of 2016 not realized? Well, it won't surprise you to know that people have a lot of theories about this. For some, the issue is that the 2016 agreement was far too lenient on FARC. For others, the problem lies in Santos' successor, having done failed to implement parts of the core related to democracy. But the truth might be that it's all of the above, plus a whole bunch of other factors, chief among which may even be consequences. Although they were officially Marxist guerrilla movements, FARC, by their final decades, had metamorphosed into the biggest and baddest cartel in the region: illegal mining, growing coca leaf, drug smuggling. If it was lucrative, they would corner the market. And not just in Colombia, but in parts of neighboring Ecuador as well. So long as FARC was running the show, there was no point in other outfits trying to move on their turn. When the majority of their fighters voluntarily disbanded following the 2016 agreement, it left a power vacuum in many of these rural regions. A vacuum other groups, of course, we've already seen the impact this had on Ecuador. There, the end of FARC's it's opened the cocaine market to Mexican cartels and bombing mafias. Local groups gave them so much money and firepower that they became impossible for them to control. In Colombia, the government drug cartel known as the Gulf Cartel. To stop turf wars breaking out over the Colombian state would have instead, after a promising start in 2017, Bogota seems to have just given up as to why it's taken so long for violence to spend. Well, let's just since the massive economic upheaval and destabilization caused by the pandemic, for example, as well as a host of operations, plus the international angle that comes with the growing closeness with the powerful regime in neighboring Venezuela. This rising violence is also due to choices made. Choices current president Gustavo Petro. Elected as Colombia's first ever left-wing leader in 2022, Petro's pitch to voters was that it implements something known as total peace. The idea was to open talks with all of the nation's remaining major armed factions, including some of the drug gangs, and finally end the continuous state of intense conflict that has gripped Colombia since 1964. All day about whether this was an idea or a naive. What's not up for debate, though, is that its implementation seemed to boil down to step 1, it's happening, step 2, big question mark, step 3, this. The government's approach to the armed wars is catastrophic. In January 2023, Petro declared a unilateral 6-month ceasefire with multiple groups from the FARC offshoot EMC to ELN. Being, armed groups, their reaction was basically to go, "Way, let's go grab some more territory, shall we?" Surprising, isn't it? Now, at the same time, Petro all but ended a long-running campaign to eradicate coca plantations. Now, in theory, this kind of makes sense. Most coca leaf in Colombia is grown by poor farmers who lack any alternative crops and thus require the cartels purely to earn enough to stay alive. A big part of the 2016 peace deal was supposed to be a plan to help these farmers find alternative crops and markets. But just like his predecessor, Duque, Petro failed to support alternatives to coca planting. The difference was that Duque kept up eradication efforts. Petro's ending of these efforts instead led to production. Here's how the Council on Foreign Relations describes what happened. The Colombian cocaine port flooded neighboring countries like Brazil, helping transform their street and prison gangs into full-blown drug cartels, and continued to increase drug overdose deaths in the United States and Europe. Nor were the effects extended in Colombia. Just last week, Daily, the city paper, reported on a new poll on Petro's agenda. A full 72% said the policy of total peace was off course, with a plurality citing public violence as the biggest concern. The second half of 2020 Yet all Colombia's recent security problems may have been exacerbated by President Petro. The truth is that these issues have been building for years. Now, the 2016 agreement we can see that many issues around it, from securing farm territories to dealing with coca farmers, are mismanaged. The problem is made worse, lacking buy-in from wider society. And while Colombia today is still far safer than it was in the 1990s, it's starting to feel like it might be slowly slipping backwards. We can only hope that this trend is going to be reversed before it's just too late. Finally, we turn our attention to the Middle East, where a wide range of regional military, diplomatic, and political leaders are all starting to sound the same alarm all at once. ISIS is coming back. It's the news that quite literally nobody wanted to hear, but if this rising consensus across the region is to be believed, then it's the news that we're apparently stuck with. One of the most powerful jihadist insurgencies that the modern world has seen, a powerful land-holding caliphate just a decade ago, was getting ready for a comeback that would put 1980s team at the signs of an ISIS comeback are all over the Middle East as operatives start to reactivate hard-to sleeper cells and illicit gangs start to move across Iraq and Syria. ISIS propaganda is shifted into a recruiting phase, and already ISIS operatives have planned quite a few attacks across the region. It's a trend that conflicts with data on regional attacks that the group has actually carried out, with those rates of attack actually remaining low thus far. It's more many more regional security experts pointing out, there is a massive difference between an ISIS that's not carrying out attacks often because it's diminished, and an ISIS that's waiting to attack because it's planning something much larger. And by the way, before we continue, just a key point on nomenclature here. For this segment, we're referring to ISIS, which specifically means the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. We're talking about other Islamic State branches in places like Somalia or the Sahel or Afghanistan. Those are the Islamic State, but they are not ISIS. We've seen some confusion about that in past episodes, so hopefully that clarifies it. Let's move on. Now, the key change in circumstances that the Islamic State is looking to exploit is the chaos and uncertainty of Syria after the fall of the Assad regime last December. As we've covered on this channel before, Syria has been through myriad ups and downs since Assad was ousted by a coalition of rebel forces, with sanctions lifted and significant progress made, but massacres of Syrian Alawites, an occupation of southern territory by Israel, and ongoing struggles in reintegrating autonomous Kurdish Riyadh, all contributing to continued instability. The idea that ISIS would want to take advantage of the chaos, certainly not a new conclusion that we're just coming to now. Instead, it's been one of the greatest fears of regional experts ever since Assad abdicated his rule. The jihadist group knows full well that thousands of former fighters are imprisoned across Syria, just waiting for an organized jailbreak, and that Syria's new security forces have had trouble organizing and extending their authority across the nation. Certainly, regional security forces have proved somewhat effective against the Islamic State over the last several months. In Syria, the Islamic State pulled off fewer than 40 attacks from January to May, while Syrian forces have disrupted several other plots and worked to build up their intelligence-gathering capabilities to monitor the group. In mid-May, the Syrian government announced its first acknowledged raid against ISIS hideouts, killing 3 members of the group and detaining 4 as they broke up a cell in Aleppo. In Iraq, ISIS launched just 4 attacks from January to May, well under 10% of what ISIS accomplished in that same time period in 2024. Iraqi forces have disrupted Islamic State operations on multiple occasions and has engaged proactively in initiatives to stay ahead of the group, dismantle cells, and attack hideouts before terror attacks can be carried out. Between the two countries, security officials say they foiled at least a dozen ISIS plots since the start of 2025. While a surface-level examination of Iraq and Syria would make it seem as if ISIS is on the retreat, that only tells half the story. For one thing, there are real logistical reasons for ISIS to have organically slowed down its pace of attacks despite the opportunities presented by regime change. In this part of the world, the Islamic State responded after being pushed out of the short-lived caliphate by changing its approach and pivoting into an asymmetric fight in the poorly controlled Syrian regions. In those areas, ISIS fighters have spent years hijacking, extorting and brutalizing communities, smuggling weapons and finances, and coordinating with the larger Islamic State network across the globe. As a result, ISIS fighters weren't well positioned to take collective action when Assad fell in a lightning assault. The tactics and organisation had to run an asymmetric jihadist version of organised crime were a very different way of tactics and organisation needed to secure the lands for a new caliphate. And at the same time, the low rates of ISIS attacks in 2025 compared to 2024 tell an underlying story. Even though ISIS has been attacking at far lower rates than it used to, its pace of attacks is slowly creeping upward. Not necessarily with casualty rates, but the smaller scale, more frequent terror operations that would allow the group to consolidate its resources, eliminate potential enemies down the line, and gather money and weapons in advance of something bigger. According to Western intelligence, foreign fighters have started to sneak back into Syria, while ISIS is known to have attempted at least 10 jailbreaks to secure the release of nearly 10,000 former fighters and their families in massive detention centers monitored by Kurdish-led paramilitary forces. It's difficult to say just how many ISIS fighters are currently located in Syria and Iraq, with estimates ranging anywhere from 1,000 fighters roaming free to over 3,000, but the fighters it does have appear to be migrating. More and more they've moved out of the open desert and into Syria's major cities. At the same time as they seem to be distributing weapons they managed to capture from Assad-era supply depots before the new regime was able to secure them. Syrian security officials indicated that ISIS is worming its way into the Ministry of Defense, while at the same time trying to recruit disillusioned former soldiers to recruit for Assad. Across Syria, more and more opportunities are popping up for ISIS to take advantage. Perhaps the most important, the one with the greatest potential for devastation, is the new Syrian government's efforts to take over the Kurdish-run ISIS detention facilities in the country's east, while at the same time starting to transfer some of the prisoners to different areas and even send foreign detainees back to their home nations. That means opportunities to attack vans or buses with prisoners being transported inside, opportunities to bring back foreign fighters after they've left the country and can re-enter more freely, and opportunities to attack the detention camps themselves in a momentary transition. Families that are released from the camps into Syrian society probably aren't going to be tracked or followed up with by a government that's still badly under-resourced, and those who still harbour loyalties to ISIS may simply be recruited again. And when ISIS takes advantage of those opportunities and others like it, it'll be working toward a resurgence that should look very different than what the group achieved in the mid-2010s. Comparing ISIS then against ISIS now might as well be a comparison between a couple of guys who learned to shoot by playing paintball on the weekends versus a platoon of battle-hardened veterans. ISIS then, in its shock and awe campaign across Iraq and Syria, was absolutely dangerous. But many of its fighters were inexperienced, its leaders were often quite naive about what it took to coordinate a war effort, and it lost operational momentum rapidly once the tides began to turn. Now though, the Islamic State is a truly global movement with franchise groups all across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Its fighters in Iraq and Syria are far more pragmatic, far more effective in combat, and far more willing to play the long game, where a creeping jihadist insurgency is at its most dangerous. Across the world, the Islamic State has established robust financial networks, figured out how to smuggle high-impact personnel and weaponry, and shifted its leadership to nations where they're far safer than they've been in Syria or Iraq. If the Islamic State senses an opportunity in the Middle East, it can flood foreign fighters from elsewhere using smuggling networks that aren't currently known in the public domain, but that ISIS's recent tactics will suggest they will be. Right now, ISIS is operating in an environment where its target nations are growing all the more vulnerable. The United States is rapidly withdrawing troops from northern Syria, pulling out of nearly a dozen outposts across the nation, and consolidating forces at one critical base where American soldiers now depart regularly often. According to reporting by the New York Times, Washington intends to keep as few as 500 troops in Syria by the time this phase of the drawdown is over. That's just a quarter of what the US had in Syria right after Assad fell. British leaders have made it clear that America's downsizing will leave a critical security gap that ISIS can exploit. Syria's security forces are nowhere near ready to assume the work of hunting ISIS down nationwide, despite the fact that the nation's new leaders are bitterly opposed to the Islamic State, the principle that Iraq is one of the poorest borders open to exploitation of jihadists. Its government and its security forces are deeply corrupt. It's in the midst of a political crisis with its own Kurdish autonomous faction in the north, and at least at the time of writing, it's become a dire donation for an escalating war between Israel and Iran. ISIS doesn't just have a short window opportunity to strike. Instead, it's balanced between two unstable nations, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, the governments of those two nations are in the process of taking action that hands greater advantages to the Islamic State. As former ISIS fighters start to be brought out of the Kurdish-run camps, as the Syrian government struggles to reconstitute, as Iraq is racked by internal turmoil, and as the US looks to leave, ISIS can sit back and watch its position just grow stronger and stronger. And it's here that we find regional and Navy intelligence leaders are sounding the alarm about ISIS, even as the group's pace of attacks is uncharacteristically slow. ISIS seems to understand that there's a window of opportunity to do something big. But in order to do something big, it has to reposition assets, distribute arms and munitions, and reorganize into a much more cohesive operation than what worked in the last few years of asymmetric warfare. And as it does so, the powers of the region and the world are making the jihadists' job easier over time, even despite the occasional raid or killing of a senior leader. ISIS will happily short-term losses, knowing that its small cells are decentralized and its leaders are just easily replaceable. And as they absorb those losses, it will do something that will see those losses repaid in kind by the people of Iraq and the people of Syria. What that attack might look like, whether a coordinated series of mass killings or an attempt to claim Damascus or a march on vulnerable Iraq, that is anybody's guess. But whatever it is, it seems as if neither Syria, nor Iraq, nor America, nor the rest of the world is prepared to stop it. Thank you very much. Welcome back to the Situation Room, your weekly ride on the clown car of human existence as it plunges over the edge. I'm Simon, and in this edition we'll be checking in on Sudan's horrific border off by so lacking, except for us, before turning our attention to a looming showdown in the Congo and then the potential annexation of Western Sahara. But first, we'll zoom in on Russian side that China is preparing to swipe some of their territory. As always, timestamps are below. Now let's begin our descent into the darkness with an appropriately quick trip to Moscow. First up, let's take a look at the Russian Federation, where a leaked document from the secretive FSB intelligence agency has revealed a long-term problem boiling under the surface. Now, when we think of the nation of Russia in terms of great power competition, we usually think about it in terms of its decades-long showdown between West, America, and the nations of NATO. But according to these new revelations, the rising superpower on Russia's doorstep is a name that Moscow increasingly regards as a threat. Rising superpower, as you know from the title, is of course China. The document in question was obtained by the New York Times and revealed by way of a story published just last week. Per the Times, the document is an 8-page document intended for internal eyes only from Russia's domestic intelligence agency, the FSB. Now, that report was invented, and as the Times points out, it could very well be a draft document. But context indicates to the article's authors that it was written a bit over a year ago, sometime in either late 2023 or early 2024. Now, the document was sourced from an organized criminal element advertising classified Russian intelligence on Telegram and was provided to the New York Times as a free sample of a larger trove, which, by policy, the Times doesn't pay for. The document was authenticated by 6 Western agencies and was described as having been consistent with both intelligence that some of those agencies had collected by themselves, and so that one particular reviewer described as consistent with Russia's known internal views on China. And just as a note, by the way, since we've been talking about literacy a bit more often in recent months, the New York Times wrote a separate article on how the document in question was obtained, and that is worth a read. The document is attributed to a shadowy counter-espionage unit within the FSB's sprawling architecture. Basically, Russian spies that make it their mission to capture spies operating inside Russia or to gain access to Russian state secrets. The unit in question, however, is focused on China, which it describes as a serious threat to Russian security, and even describes it directly as, quoting here, the enemy. The document indicates that China is actively stepping up recruitment efforts in Russia to release spies, including Russian scientists who may be willing to talk, and it's focusing its efforts on technology. Their targets for recruitment include government officials, defense and scientific experts, members of the Russian oligarchy, and journalists, among others. Their methods include collecting mass amounts of data and recruiting sources, academics with connections to Chinese intelligence. When it comes to what China's after, there are a few different answers here. Of particular interest to the CCP is the performance of Western weapons in Ukraine, as well as technical research on unmanned drones, and especially military aviation. China is a step behind Russia in many areas, despite having more such as its combat aircraft. Particularly interested in people who once worked on Russia's sea-skimming aircraft. Massive half-plane, half-ship hovercrafts that Russia is now actively working. For China, that's likely a point of such intense interest because similar designs would be immensely helpful in a sea invasion of Taiwan. They also appear to be interested in the Wagner Group, the mercenary organization Russia has deployed across the globe to inform China's own future use of mercenaries and its operations. Notably, Chinese mercenary groups have broken since the time this document seems to have been written, although they certainly aren't a common geopolitical fixture quite yet. But China's spies also appear interested in data that would help them make direct claims to Russian territory. The nations share a border of 4,200 kilometers, that's 27 miles, and Russia has long been concerned about nationalist Chinese claims to lands that Russia owns back in the 1800s. China has reported researching for evidence that an ancient Chinese diaspora lived in these places, seemingly reuniting times with great property of a future territory. Elsewhere, China is alleged in this document to be using mining companies and universities in the Arctic as a front for espionage work, and Russia fears that Chinese spies have spread elsewhere, especially as Russia has military operations in Ukraine. has also been building up its own influence in the post-Soviet countries that Moscow has long viewed as its own vassal states. Per the document, Russia is working hard to control China's perceptions of the war in Ukraine, feeding as much positive information as possible to known operatives and seeding Russia's own internal documents with favorable information that Chinese infiltrators might have upon. Now, the idea that China would be spying on Russia far beyond the way that it's sort of implied in global affairs that everybody is spying on everybody might be a surprise. After all, to onlookers in the United States or in Europe, China and Russia are nearly always portrayed as friends or even allies on the global stage. These are the same two nations that just recently declared a no-limits partnership and that have been increasingly described as the most powerful members of a new axis that also includes Iran and North Korea. They take great pride in standing united in a posture opposing the Western world. They both seem to be planning to war with NATO member nations in the next decade, and seem to be working hard to strengthen their relationship, not to tear it down. And indeed, that read of the situation is inaccurate. The two nations are both highly ambitious, and they agree that they would rather be opposing NATO than opposing each other. When it comes to recent talk about splitting apart Russia and China, well, the alternative would be for either of them to go it alone or to take up with the US and Europe, and there's very little chance of that happening. So, certainly, the geopolitical frame of an aligned Russia and China makes good sense in the mid-2020s, and at least for the time being, those nations are best understood as being strategic partners, as their leaders test. Indeed, this very document discusses ways that China is working to prop up Russia, including building supply chains that allow China to transfer technology to Russia while getting around international sanctions. The document also discusses Chinese offers to help produce drones and high-tech warfighting equipment. According to experts with knowledge of Russia's internal military intelligence postures, however, Russia's deeper perceptions of China are a different story. As former CIA station chief and Belfer Center fellow Paul Colby put it for the New York Times, quote, "You don't have to scratch very deep in any Russian military or intel official to get a deep suspicion of China. In the long run, China is, in spite of the unlimited partnership and how useful they are, also a potential threat." End quote. So the problem at the core of China and Russia's modern relationship is the problem of relative power. Not necessarily how powerful either country is on the world stage, but how powerful they are when compared to each other. Russia possesses one of the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Its capital was very recently the capital of a bona fide superpower, and its military was among the most feared in the world until it was knocked down to size by Ukraine. But China's power is rising rapidly, whether on matters economic, cultural, military, or anything else, and it is China, not Russia, that's likely to end the 21st century as a true global power. To put it simply, these two nations have the dynamic of a big brother and a little brother, if, that is, both countries insisted that they were the big brother in the relationship. And while Russia can still get away with throwing its weight around as a relative equal to China, it won't be able to do that for very much longer. It's not yet clear what will happen to the Russian economy after years upon years of overheating to fuel the war in Ukraine, but what happens afterward, it certainly isn't going to be good. Russia's military has already been served a heaping plate of humble pie, and the nation's defense industrial complex does not appear ready to replenish the stocks of advanced equipment that's been lost. The nation is widely expected to enter a difficult period after the death or departure of Vladimir Putin, who has no clear successor, and its economy is already hardly a tenth of the size of China. Meanwhile, China's economy continues to show strong growth year over year. It's building a world-class military with the intent to directly rival the United States. Its nuclear arsenal is expected to reach the size of Russia's in just a few years, but it has built itself into a nation that will almost certainly enjoy superpower status for the next century at a bare minimum. For Russia, the ultimate conclusion may be inevitable. Given enough time on its current trajectory compared to China or on China's current trajectory, Russia seems to be poised for a slow decline to status, while it's China, just next door, the dominant force in Eurasia for quite a while, with India potentially rising to eclipse Russia too. In that world, Russia could become to China what Europe was to the United States from the 1990s to the 2010s. Russia's abundant mineral resources, its unfettered access to the Arctic, and its immense reserves of oil and other energy sources are all things that China wants. As Russia grows weaker over time, China will be able to offer hardship and protection in exchange. And even if that can cause that Russia ultimately doesn't escape delays, it can at least be delayed for quite a while. For Moscow, the best way to do that is by maintaining as many competitive advantages with China as possible for as long as possible. As long as Russia is able to demand China's respect militarily, economic and technological resources that China doesn't have, Russia can preserve a relationship of equals. It can avoid playing second fiddle, stave off the worst case scenarios, economic subordination, or worse, outright territorial annexation. Conversely, if China can gain access to Russia's many state secrets, it can elevate itself to condition the threat posed by a future rival. To be sure, that's an effort that will take decades. But it's when Beijing is playing the long game that it is really at its most dangerous. As for what Russia is doing about all of this, the document analyzed by The Times does give some indicators. For one, Russia is reportedly paying close attention to its own citizens in China, especially in technically or strategically sensitive areas. They've been working to educate Russians who might the intelligence focus of their work. They've been harvesting mass amounts of data from WeChat, the immensely popular Chinese messaging app. People who are thought to have been targeted by China have had their phones hacked and scraped for data by the FSB. All the while, the document outlines a careful dance that FSB agents have been trying to get right, investigating and engaging in counter-espionage efforts as much as possible without upsetting the delicate geopolitical balance between Moscow and Beijing. Classifying China as a potential enemy, as this report clearly does, is something that's not supposed to be done in any public-facing way. And to be clear, it is unlikely that a leak of this document to the New York Times would somehow precipitate a Russia-China breakup. As a rule, we should assume that by the time an internal Russian document is leaked to the Western press, China is already well aware of it, and despite the apparent veracity of the document, it's the sort of thing that each nation can very easily deny. In fact, the vast majority of their citizens will probably never hear about this, thanks to strict internet controls, and as long as that's true, it doesn't really matter that much. The thing about great power competition like this is that although grand shifts in the balance of power can only come at a glacial pace, they're usually something that every side can see coming for quite some time before it actually hits. China is almost that Russia would be concerned with China's status as a long-term rival, while Russia almost certainly knows that China knows. Instead, leaks and reports like this are confirmation, shining a spotlight onto the espionage that's behind closed doors. It's one thing to assume that all of this is happening, but it's quite another to see it play out before our eyes. When the end finally came, the Zamzam camp, it did so with a brutality beyond anything the hardened observers of Sudan expected. Situated 15 kilometers southwest of the North Darfur capital, Al-Fasher, Zamzam had swollen since the outbreak of fighting in 2023 as civilians fled beyond support of the Rapid Support Forces or RSF. By this April, 700,000 people may have been living there, a crush of humanity crammed into an area just 8 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. But what was meant to be a place of safety would soon become a death trap. After rampaging across most of Darfur, the RSF laid siege to Zamzam in May 2023. By late August, the situation had become so desperate that famine had been declared. As one witness told the Associated Press, quote, "Too long, there was no option but to grass the trees." So long as the camp held out, though, there was still the chance that things could return to normal. The basic healthcare center remained operational. People still had their homes. These were people who had fled to Zamzam ahead of the RSF's precursor, the Janjaweed militias, who carried out the Darfur genocide. In short, Zamzam may have been a sprawling, overcrowded, displaced persons camp in the middle of the desert, but it was also the only thing most of its residents still had. At least, they did have until April 10th. That evening, RSF forces massed on the camp's perimeter. Just 20 days earlier, the paramilitaries had been dealt a serious blow over 800 kilometers east when the Sudanese armed forces had driven them from the capital of Khartoum. Now it seems like the group was out for revenge. Here's how the government described what happened next, quote, "The Rapid Support Forces began the onslaught, shelling, firing from anti-aircraft guns, mounted pickup trucks, and storming into the camp, chanting racial slurs as they fired on their victims. Zamzam's residents, it was the start of a long weekend hell. For roughly 4 days, the paramilitaries rampaged through the camp, firing machine guns into crowds, looting and burning homes, carrying out the mass sexual assault of women and girls. According to satellite imagery analysed by Yale School of Public Health's Humanitarian Research Lab, a full 10% of the camp was reduced to ashes. The one remaining medical centre was destroyed, and all of its workers were executed. Nearly 500,000 fled, the bulk of them towards the besieged city of Al-Fasher, now the last holdout of the Sudanese armed forces in the whole of Darfur, a region larger than California. There, they found a city under constant bombardment, teetering on the brink of collapse. But at least 150,000 of Zamzam's population chose to flee west towards the town of Tawila. The new humanitarian explains that Tawila is considered a safe spot since it's under the command of the Sudan Liberation Army Abdul Wahid, a rebel group that has declared itself neutral in the conflict between the military and the RSF. Sadly, covering these 60 kilometers between Zamzam and Tawila, it would become an ordeal in and of itself. A recent article in Project Syndicate describes how RSF fighters ran down and attacked those traveling by road, desperate to avoid paramilitaries, and tried to escape through the desert, where satellite imagery shows scores likely died of dehydration or heat exhaustion. An outpost of Médecins Sans Frontières operating out of Tawila reported, quoting here, children who were literally dying of thirst upon arrival. Taken together, it's unknown how many people perished in the RSF assault on Zamzam and the subsequent flight across the desert. The estimates at least 400 died in the camp alone, but reports from the humanitarian collected from the ground suggest the true number is. As for the death toll on the road to Tawila, journalists at Project Syndicate merely write, in total, thousands of people. Now after that harrowing opening, you may be wondering why we're covering this story 2 months after the fact. Why it's featuring an episode of Situation Room in mid-June rather than back in April. Well, the reason's simple. Rather than the massacre itself, we wanted to put the international reaction to the massacre, or rather, the lack of reaction. 2 months after the RSF carried out a horrific war crime, one their own fighters gleefully filmed and posted to social media, the default position of the world seems to be a shrug. A sense that maybe it's bad, but what are we going to do about it? That raises a really important question. Why? Why didn't the destruction of Zamzam become Sudan's Srebrenica moment? The massacre that, as with Srebrenica during the Bosnian War, finally forced the end. After all, the initial response was strong. As the Sudan War Monitor reported at the time, quote, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a statement today strongly condemning the killing of civilians. In mid-May, the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs even held a hearing on the atrocity. But actually, concrete developments in response to the slaughter have been totally absent. Humanitarian budgets go unfunded. International protests against the killings are orbiting busy. Governments, including African governments, issue words of condemnation and then do nothing. Trying to figure out why, that's going to be the goal of this segment. First, though, a super fast refresher for those of you who aren't up to speed on the conflict in Sudan. Erupting in April of 2023, Sudan's war began as a power struggle between two allied factions. A couple of years earlier, the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary RSF collaborated to overthrow the civilian-led government formed in the wake of the toppling of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. In 2023, both were angry to become Sudan's sole authority. What started as a battle between two armed factions on the streets of Khartoum quickly morphed into the most chaotic, cruel conflict happening anywhere on Earth. As the army retreated east toward the Red Sea coast, the RSF overran the western region of Darfur. Ethnic massacres, the mass sexual assault of women and girls, and the enslavement of civilians all became common. Across the nation, cities were ransacked and burned. Khartoum was reduced to a cellular shell. Agricultural lands were torched, and both sides blocked aid from getting in, leading to widespread starvation. All told, it's thought today that 13 million Sudanese have been displaced by the fight. As early as May 2024, the United States Special Envoy was sharing estimates that 150,000 have been killed, a total likely to have skyrocketed since then. Exactly how much, though? That's impossible to say. While there are plenty of high-quality studies trying to estimate the death tolls in Gaza and Ukraine, in Sudan, there are almost none. One of the few serious studies by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine estimated over 61,000 had died in Khartoum state alone by summer of 2020. And that was before Khartoum even saw the last of crisis. What we're trying to say is that Sudan's war is one of the most apocalyptic conflicts the world has seen in recent years. It remains firmly under the radar, and that, to be honest, is just pretty fucking wild, isn't it? Usually, when we discuss ignored wars on this channel, it's stuff like the Congo or the anarchy sweeping Haiti, objectively awful, important stories, but also stories where the fighting was either contained or the death toll remains in the thousands. It's rare for a war to blow up that kills over 150,000 people in a single year, features the complete collapse of a vast country, and sucks in outside powers as varied as Iran, Russia, the UAE, and Turkey, yet generates comparatively few wars. As yet, history documented. Ban Abu Bakr told Newlands magazine that the lack of coverage in Sudan pretty rare. We've transgressed all these benchmarks. The world's worst humanitarian crisis, the world's worst famine, the world's worst ex-wives. We see this over and over again. It just goes. Alright, so now let's try and unpack why that might be. Now, one possibility is the lack of insight. During the Tigray War of 2020 to 2022, the government-imposed blackout on the northern Ethiopian region is a major factor in the lack of coverage, despite a death toll that reputable sources have put as high as 600,000. Certainly soon lack of internet. Shutdowns were put in place as soon as the fighting started, while both sides are destroying infrastructure. The trouble with this is that it relies on a lack of visual content stopping the conflict from breaking through in our image-focused age. Yet, fighters for the RSF proudly post their war crimes on social media. With a bit of Googling, you could go watch GoPro footage from the destruction of Zamzam right now. So, it's unlikely to be images and video that's causing the world to run away. And that brings us to the next thing. The world's already so chaotic that Sudan just hasn't broken through our attentions. At the moment the Sudan conflict ignited, the eyes of the world were still fixed on Ukraine, a war in which American allies in Europe had a visible stake, in which Vladimir Putin was threatening nuclear Armageddon, and to which billions of dollars worth of American equipment were being shipped. Then, just 6 months later, Israel suffered its worst terror attack in history and the Gaza war began. It's hard to imagine 2 years more likely to suck up all the attention from Ukraine and Gaza. One is super important for Europe, one caused outrage across the entire Islamic world, and both gobbled up attention in America. Perhaps the world just didn't have any more bandwidth to add Sudan to the mix. As ABC News deftly noted, media organizations and citizens alike struggle to follow multiple foreign crises at once. Now, theory like this is hard to prove or disprove one way or the other. Certainly, there are conflicts that have failed to break through the hold Ukraine and Gaza have on the news. How often do you see something about Myanmar's civil war? The counterpoint might be that 2025 began with a 2-month ceasefire in Gaza. 2 months in which the war slowly dropped down the headlines. But rather than be all like, great, let's give all the extra space to Sudan, let's instead pivoted to covering the chaos around Trump's tariffs. This, despite spring 2025 featuring one of the most significant moments in the Sudan war so far, as Putin was finally taken. Of course, that's not to say that extremely brave journalists were there on the front lines, putting themselves in unbelievable danger to report back what was happening. But that coverage wasn't given much prominence by media organizations, all of which suggests a different dynamic at play. One theory we saw from international media support is that Sudan is an extremely dangerous environment for reporters. After suffering beatings doled out by the military and targeted killings carried out by the RSF, most journalists have fled. According to the Sudan Media Forum, as 70 reporters may be working in the conflict zone today, nearly all of them are carrying out their work in secret to protect their lives. As a result, only a trickle of information gets out. Naturally, that means there's less for media organizations to report on compared to stuff like Ukraine. The government actively encourages journalists to come report on. The flip side is that Gaza is also incredibly dangerous to report. While some 200 Palestinian reporters have been killed in the fighting, it hasn't stopped events like those in each comes with a caveat that stops it from being satisfying. Clear, we're not saying you, sat at home, should feel bad that you're not constantly worrying about the most of us just have way too much stuff going on in our lives to also add full-time out-of-our conflicts to our to-do list. But we are saying that our leaders and media organisations should care more. And we include YouTube channels like ours on that list. All of us with a voice, should be doing our best to make sure Sudan's conflict stays on the world's radar, especially after atrocities like that seen at Zamzam. Because if we don't, then massacres like this, they'll just keep happening. Sudan will have more and more Srebrenica moments, more moments where civilians and children suffer horrors beyond those that we expect even in wartime. Look, we might not be able to do anything to stop it, but at the very least, we can try and make sure that the world doesn't ignore it. And from Sudan, we turn southward to the Congo, where the nation's current presidents appear to be preparing for the nuclear clash. One speaks of peace, the other accuses of treason, and whether either of them intends it or not, they are both making themselves appealing for international actors to create a proxy war. Now, before we talk about the battle, let's introduce the players. Felix Antoine Tshisekedi, age 61, currently serves as the 5th president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he's been continually since January 2019. Tshisekedi is widely regarded as an autocrat by Africa, especially after the re-election in the 2023 contest that was conducted in an openly and excessively fraudulent. On the other side of our proverbial cage match is former President Joseph Kabila Kabange. Predecessor, he held office from 2001 until 2022. Kabila took power just 10 days after his father, the former president, was assassinated in office. He too presided over a dictatorship marked by electoral fraud, systemic corruption, and many human rights violations, all of which Tshisekedi has inherited. When Tshisekedi took power in 2019, he and Kabila formed the Power Sharing Agreement, in which Kabila's political party, the Congo, would control over the nation's parliament and provinces, while Tshisekedi would control the nation's highest office. If that sounds like the sort of devil's bargain between paramount dictators that would almost certainly break international order, well then you, sir, have a fantastic read on the situation. Cracks starting to show almost within 2 years, Tshisekedi already Kabila despite Kabila's age. The government purged itself of pro-Kabila figures, targeted itself with investigations, and ultimately allowed him to leave the country, which he did by self-imposed exile in 2023. Since then, he's lived mostly in South Africa, where he received a doctorate and, according to Kabila himself, spent a lot of time on his workstation. He's a hell of a guy to have popular fortnight. But at the time that Kabila was having his political infrastructure torn apart in the early 2020s and before he left the country, the Congo was gripped by a very sort of threat of power battles between the current and former dictator. Starting in March 2022, a powerful rebel organization called M23 went on the offensive in the eastern Congo, in resource-rich provinces like Rwanda. M23 has been consistently accused of receiving direct support from Rwanda, which by all accounts it does seem to, and as an apparent proxy force, it's proved instrumental in seizing Congolese land where valuable resources can be mined from Rwanda and M23's financial benefit. For the next several years, M23 slowly escalated its offensive until January and February of this year, when the rebel group captured 2 provincial capital cities back-to-back. The city of Goma in the province of North Kivu, and the city of Bukavu in the province of South Kivu. Now, we've covered these military offensives extensively here on this channel if you'd like to go back and learn more about them, of course, after you've finished watching this fantastic episode. M23's rapid military gains have created a rebel zone in eastern Congo, with the group now in full control of the Congo's border with Rwanda, still drawing on support from the Rwandan government, and now entirely able to mine and ship resources as Rwanda's leaders see fit. The Congo, meanwhile, is in a state of acute political crisis, with the nation's military quite visibly unable to handle the rebel group in its areas of greatest strength, and with the rest of the government too corrupt and too self-interested to act effectively. Even worse, for the Congo and its people, M23 has vowed to march on the capital and conquer the nation outright. While international mediators have been able to avert a continued M23 push so far, there are an estimated 4,000 to 7,000 Rwandan soldiers in the Congo who are ready to help with a westward push at any time. So when exiled ex-dictator Joseph Kabila showed up in M23-controlled areas back in late May, the conclusions that Tshisekedi and the Congolese elite would reach about his intentions were practically obvious to see. For weeks prior to his return, Kabila had taken to the global press, explaining that he intended to visit his home nation and find a solution to the M23 conflict. But the former dictator has long been accused by the current dictator, among others, of being the mastermind behind the M23 organization. By Tshisekedi's telling, it's Kabila who's been the hidden hand behind M23 all along, using Rwanda's help to bring the Congo back under his control by force. So, when Kabila turns up in the rebel-held city of Goma sporting a peace-loving energy and a brand new moustache, the reaction from the Tshisekedi government was entirely predictable. Late last month, the Congo Senate stripped Kabila of his immunity as a specially appointed senator for life, opening him up to prosecution on a range of charges, including treason, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In early June, Tshisekedi's allies banned the media from reporting on Kabila or his activities or speaking to members of Kabila's political party. Now, Kabila denies any association to M23, to Rwanda, or to the broader array of insurgent elements in the Congo. By Kabila's own telling, he's returned strictly for a peace mission with the intent to broker an arrangement between M23 and the internationally recognized Congolese government. Certainly, some of the evidence against Kabila is suspect. Opposition leaders who've accused him of crimes are believed to have done so under duress, and the Congo has been either unwilling or unable to produce specific, direct evidence of Kabila's complicity with M23. At the same time, however, Kabila has been welcomed with open arms in M23-controlled areas. He spent a lot of time doing PR appearances that make M23's leadership look pretty good, and he hasn't given any indication of how long he'll stay in M23 territory or whether he even intends to leave. Quite frankly, international observers would be well within their right to assume the worst on both sides. This is a conflict where there are precisely zero good guys except innocent civilians trapped in the middle, and where both Kabila and Tshisekedi are top operators in one of the most corrupt and blood-soaked mineral extraction zones in the world. And whatever the truth of Kabila's motivations, it's very hard to ignore the optics here. The nation's longtime dictator and a certified Tshisekedi hater is cozying up to a rebel group that can bring Tshisekedi down, while Tshisekedi and his government rain so many accusations down on Kabila's head that they've left zero room for future reconciliation. And although the idea of a domestic dictator battle royale is fascinating enough, the stakes get even higher when we factor in the global stakes of the Congo conflict. This is a part of the world with immense mineral value, accounting for up to 80% of the world's cobalt, over 40% of tantalum, and over a fifth of its diamonds, a tenth of its copper. Any nation would stand to gain massively in the DRC, where very low costs of production, weak borders, and weaker industry protections make it very easy to exploit the land and its bounties. China controls legal mining and illegal mining operations in the Congo and has invested heavily in the infrastructure needed to help exploit the nation's resources. Russia is willing to have sent mercenaries to the Congo to offer regime protection and access to minerals. The United States is working to make a deal with the DRC, clearing the way for US investment in the country's mining sector while gaining control of a greater share of the resources that are available. The European Union has enmeshed itself deeply within the Congo for centuries. But in a moment in history where global dynamics are shifting rapidly, there's little reason to believe that the Congo would evolve into some strange other world where competitive major powers suddenly have no interest in gaining full control for themselves. If Russia, China, the US, and the EU all agree that the Congo is a very important source of resources, the likely next step isn't going to be collaboration, but confrontation. And now, more than ever, the Congo is primed for exploitation by way of proxy. M23 has a clear base of power and regional backer. A clash between M23 and forces of the Congo would be a fair fight. And now, both sides are led by a figure who's become larger than life in Congolese affairs. Felix Tshisekedi representing the internationally recognized government, and Joseph Kabila representing M23 and all that comes with it. Already it's not difficult to see where global powers would end up. China's a very strong diplomatic and economic partner. For one, Beijing is the largest trading partner. It invests heavily into Rwandan infrastructure, it's cancelled Rwandan debt unilaterally, and it benefits from Rwanda's support in international diplomacy. Russia, too, is strongly the nation's leader, openly defending Russian mercenary operations across the continent. Both nations would have little to lose by pivoting to support M23 if believed, as they may have good reason into that M23 could sweep across the nation with the right help. Meanwhile, the United States under Donald Trump has made it clear that it'll work with Tshisekedi despite his many flaws, as large resources keep flowing, and the EU's heavy investments into the DRC's internationally recognized government would suggest that it too would favor Tshisekedi. These same nations, the US and many countries of the EU, seem to be souring on Rwanda, starting to grow tired of Kagame's constant exploitation of his place in the global order. And even if Joseph Kabila's intentions are pure in Goma, even if he really does see himself as a broker of peace between these two sides, he could still very easily become a patsy for one side of this conflict. In the current conditions, Kabila's chances of returning to Tshisekedi's embraces are vanishingly small, and Tshisekedi has made it abundantly clear that he'd like Kabila's head on a platter. Meanwhile, Kabila has shown that he's no stranger to dictatorial autocracy or to personal enrichment as a byproduct of his power. If Rwanda, and potentially Russia, China, and other allies can convince Kabila that there's no chance of peace and offer him a path to power if he'll lead the war effort, then they'd gain the support of a figure whose mandate to lead the Congo is about as solid as Tshisekedi's. Kabila has already made himself into a credible challenger, launching allegations of tyranny against his rival and facing the death penalty if he was to his government. Right now, in the weeks immediately following Kabila's return, M23 is in the process of ramping up its military operations again. In the course of the last month, rebels have targeted pro-government militias in North Kivu province, particularly in densely populated areas, in an apparent effort to secure a better hold on their logistical and supply routes. These rival militias have given fierce opposition and don't they're slowly being beaten down as the weeks have gone on. At the same time, M23 has purged areas that it controls of fighting-age men who might oppose them, weapons and arrest them. Incredibly used detention and torture as part of those purges. As the group consolidates control over its captured territory, it'll be easier and easier for new weapons and fighters to flow in via Rwanda. Once those supply lines are secure, Rwanda and its international allies could tackle the war effort, and if Joseph Kabila remains in Goma for much longer, he may become the leader of an effort to bring down Tshisekedi. And in our final story of the day today, we visit the disputed territory of Western Sahara, the final remaining colony on the African continent. Sparsely populated, with about 70% of its territory administered by the nation of Morocco, Western Sahara's status has been subject to for decades. But over the last several months, it's become clear that a resolution on Western Sahara is imminent, as a growing list of nations throw their support behind Morocco's claim to sovereignty. The most recent moment of change for Western Sahara came on Thursday, June the 5th, when the West African nation of Ghana endorsed a plan to settle the region's status once and for all. Under Morocco's proposal, which the nation has been trying to get adopted since the mid-2000s, Western Sahara would be recognized globally as Moroccan territory, adding 272,000 square kilometers of territory to the nation in the process. The Moroccan government in Rabat will assume full control over the territory's foreign affairs and full responsibility for its defense. In return, the territory would be granted an autonomous status, and the territory's native people, the Sahrawi, granted the ability to manage most of their own affairs. Its plan with complex implications in a place with a difficult and bloody history where questions of sovereignty are concerned, and Ghana, like most of the world, has declined to support Morocco's proposal for many years. But as of just under 2 weeks ago, Ghana's stars, heralding the deal as, quote, the only realistic and sustainable basis for a mutually agreed solution. Ghana's endorsement is certainly going to go a long way in Africa. After all, it's one of the continent's most stable, free, and globally influential nations, as well as Africa's first nation to gain independence after World War II, and a historical leader of the Pan-African movement. But Ghana is just the latest of the nations that have recognized the proposal as it gradually gains momentum on a global stage. It was the United States under Donald Trump that first decided to recognize Morocco's claim to Western Sahara, a decision made in the final days of his first stint as president, when his successor had already been elected. For a while, the US was the only nation to make that decision, until France, critically, Morocco's closest neighbor, Spain, chose to recognize it in 2022. Somalia followed soon afterward, becoming the first African nation to agree to Morocco's terms, with Guatemala then years after Israel weighed in, the issue went entirely off the ground of international diplomacy until later this year. That's when Kenya signed on to Morocco's proposal, becoming the second African nation to do so, and the first African nation that's regarded as something beyond the continent. By the way, we're sorry, Somalia, if it's any consolation, we've said that before we tried to seriously, allegedly. Just a few days after Kenya, the United Kingdom threw its considerable weight behind the Moroccan autonomy plan, and then a few days after that, Ghana. In all three cases, the decision came amidst ongoing efforts to build closer ties with Morocco's leaders and take advantage of some upcoming economic opportunities that we'll discuss later in this segment. Now, this new wave of rather optimistic, breezy endorsements for Morocco isn't to say that the question of Western Sahara is an easy one to answer. As we've mentioned, the territory is historically home to the Sahrawi people, a diaspora of some 650,000 people across the globe, including 160,000 still in Western Sahara, 90,000 and about 175,000 living as refugees in Algeria. For decades, a part of Western Sahara has been under the control of the Polisario, the Sahrawi nationalist liberation movement that fought a war against Morocco from 1976 to 1991. The Polisario is the armed force of a partially recognized government called the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic that's currently recognized by about 40 global nations including Iran, Mexico, Colombia, and the Polisario Front has long benefited from the support of Algeria, where Sahrawi refugees live in the barren Western Today, Western Sahara is divided physically and figuratively. About 70% of the territory is under the control of Morocco, including all of the coastline and most of the lands, while the remaining 30% is under the control of the Polisario Front. Hardly anybody lives out in these lands, especially after they were cut off from the rest of Western Sahara by a line of simple giant sandbergs built by Morocco and running about territorial. Morocco has heavily fought since 2020, the ceasefire that governed Western Sahara since 1991 has been broken, with both sides engaged in very low-grade fighting, but neither side taking casualties with any real frequency. In a practical sense, the work of governing the Sahrawi and the free zone of Western Sahara is done at the refugee camps in Algeria, and the Sahrawi have practically no choice in gaining the sovereignty. So, when we come to the all-important question, why now? One part of the answer to just why nations are rallying behind Morocco's proposal is because there's simply not much of an alternative anymore. The Polisario Front lacks the means to challenge Morocco in the way that it once did, and Sahrawi sovereignty barely qualifies as a pipe dream under the current circumstances. But although the Polisario Front are very weak, the front has long been observed growing increasingly radical, even jihadist in some of its forms. Recent investigations by the global press have dug up clear associations with the Iran-backed organization Hezbollah. As the research analyst Ahmad Sharawi explained in a recent article via the National Interest, the Polisario Front has a history of allowing groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda to operate in the areas it controls, while its recent contacts with Iran indicate that at least one prominent Polisario leader endorsed joining Iran's axis of resistance. The group's recent targeting of Moroccan civilians, its attempts to procure drones, and repeated allegations of child soldiers have made it a far less palatable ally and led it to be regarded as a potential security threat. Situated far too close for comfort to the mouth of the Mediterranean, the sovereign back of Algeria appears happy to provide continued support to Polisario fighters. The potential for the group to become something of a Sahara version of Yemen's Houthis is pretty difficult to ignore. At the same time, Morocco has worked hard to some vision for the territory, one of highest autonomy, and if all goes according to plan, economic prosperity. Morocco is well on its way to constructing a new airport worth the equivalent of $1.2 billion in a coastal city called Dakhla. There, Morocco plans to build a trade port, a fishing port, a shipyard, and a oil terminal, linking the entire city to Morocco's national highway network. When complete, the director of construction for the project expects it to handle 35 million tons of goods each year. That's according to an interview with CNN last month. Morocco hopes to use the port as the first step to process natural resources which have historically needed to be shipped out of Africa in order to be refined. Meanwhile, Western Sahara itself is rich in phosphate and may have deposits of other lucrative minerals, including cobalt and lithium. Also, Morocco will be jointly hosting the World Cup in a couple of years alongside Spain and Portugal, which appears to have played into the decision-making process for the UK at a minimum. On the same day as Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced the UK's new support for Western Saharan autonomy under Morocco, he also signed an agreement to step up collaboration on critical infrastructure development in the nation, something that's sure to help with the World Cup, but could also end up extending to development efforts in Western Sahara to the south. With Morocco growing into a more important economic partner in Africa, long-standing disagreements over Sahrawi sovereignty have increasingly been treated like an inconvenient obstacle to collaboration rather than a pervasive issue. That change has come at the same time as the US-led Global West has seemed to lose a bit of its appetite for principled diplomatic stands in favor of resource extraction, mimicking the decisions that competitors like Russia and China have already made. Not only that, but the rising concerns over the Polisario front as a security threat have created real incentives to take action now, instead of waiting too long or ignoring a metastasizing problem, as was done with the Houthis or Hezbollah. Western Europe and the United States are on board, and with both Ghana and Kenya piling on in the last few weeks, the nations of Africa may feel as if they have increased latitude to follow suit, now that it's been proven that influential African nations can take the leap with little consequence. Morocco, meanwhile, has graciously welcomed the announcements with all the restraint and poise of a nation that's been vindicated and now knows that it holds the initiative. Algeria's complaints, and those of the Sahrawi, have fallen on deaf ears. Neither Russia nor China, Algeria's historic allies, have come to the Sahrawi's defense. The transformation isn't done yet, and until more nations sign on, Morocco doesn't quite have the mandate to swoop in and finish the job. But as Morocco gains more and more momentum, it's worth wondering, what will it actually look like for Morocco to assert control? Will that process be violent? And what will happen to the Sahrawi people who've left the nation or joined the Polisario front, or both? Will the Polisario step up violent attacks, usher in a bloody few years across West Africa? Or can the Sahrawi liberation movement be convinced to give up the game and integrate quietly into a new status quo that should work well enough for everyone? If the current trends on Western Sahara continue, then we're going to find out in several years. Hopefully we're all more prepared today to understand. And as always, thank you for watching. Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show that glances around the world and says it's a nice international order we've got there. Be a shame if it all got super f***ed up. I'm Simon Whistler, and this week is zeroing in on the resurgent Houthi attacks rocking the Red Sea, where 2 ships have already been sunk. After that, it's a hop over to Africa, where Ukraine seems to be attempting to build anti-Russia alliances in the Sahel, and it's then to the nation of Georgia to check in on the mass anti-government protests that blew up late last year. Before we finally pivot back to Africa, where the government of Togo is cracking down hard on pro-democracy demonstrations. Timestamps are below. I'm back from holiday. I'm in a new office. It's been a busy couple of weeks. Let's dive in. Houthi rebels sink 2 trade ships in the Red Sea. In our lead story today, we turn to the Red Sea, where just barely a couple of weeks after the conclusion of the Iran-Israel war, Yemen's Houthi rebels have decided that the Middle East won't even be getting a moment of peace and quiet. It is the Middle East, after all. In a pair of sophisticated attacks on the open water, the Houthis have sunk not 1, but 2 large trade ships, killed several civilian crew, and proved that they remain a potent threat even after heavy bombardment from Israel and Norway. The first attack came on July the 6th. A bulk carrier called the Magic Seas came fire off the Yemeni coast. Owned by a Greek shipping company and flying the flag of Liberia, the Magic Seas was located 50 miles southeast of the port of Hot north towards the south coast and the Canal with a payload of iron and fertilizer. Apparently without warning, the ship came under surprise attack by a group of 8-man small boats with Houthi fighters on board carrying rifles and rocket launchers. The Houthis aboard the skiffs fired the Magic Seas but declined to board it before departing. Shortly afterward, it was attacked by a group of unmanned surface vessels, or USVs, better known simply as drone boats. Laden with explosives and coordinated remotely from afar, sea drones are a particularly troubling threat to civilian and military vessels alike. They're both very hard to detect, approach, and all but guaranteed to hit the target's waterline if they detonate successfully, meaning that they're going to rip a hole through the side of whatever vessel they're attacking. For the Magic Seas, the situation was as bad as one might imagine. An onboard armed security group managed to destroy 2 of the seaplanes, but the other 2 couldn't be stopped in time. The ship hit and taken on water, and its crew was forced to evacuate eventually, rescued by rescue. According to the rebels themselves, the ship was then attacked by missiles and aerial drones, boarded, with explosives, and sunk. That appears to have been validated with video footage. By the time the Magic Seas was evacuated, an international response to the crisis was already in place. The nation of Israel is most Yemen. It's been targeted with long-range missiles and drones by the Houthis for years, as the Houthis try to show fighting solidarity with the forces of Hamas in Gaza. This time, however, Israel responded directly to the attack on the Magic Seas, launching airstrikes across the 3 port cities of Hodeidah, Al-Salif, and Ras Issa. All 3 port cities serve as powerful Houthis, as well as areas that facilitate the lucrative trade of weapons smuggling that the Houthis use to prop them up. Israel also targeted a power station and captured car carrier trade ship the Galaxy League. First seized by the Houthis, through the Galaxy League was turned into a group fitted with a radar system to help spot other trade ships. The Houthis claim to have helped force Israeli warplanes to retreat with a salvo of anti-aircraft. Although given the extent of Israel's strikes, it does not appear that the nation's combat jets were actually killed from their work. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saree stated that his organization launched missiles and drones against Israel's Ben Gurion airport, a pair of ports, and a power station in direct retaliation, although Israel was not hit by any retributive attack. On the following day, the situation in the Red Sea only got worse. That day, a second bulk carrier ship came under Houthi attack in spots close to where the Magic Seas lived. This second ship, the Eternity Sea, was also owned by a Greek company and flight to Liberia, heading northward to the Suez Canal when it came under attack. The broad strokes of the Houthi attack were consistent with the prior day's work, although the specifics differed somewhat. This time, 4 manned speedboats attacked the ship in unison, hitting it with arrows and rifle fire before several aerial drones attacked from above. While the attack didn't strike at the Eternity Sea's waterline, it did strike the ship's deck, where at least 4 crew members were killed and 2 others seriously injured. Conflicting sources suggest that sea drones were employed in the attack, although the truth isn't yet clear at the time of writing. The ship's bridge said boats sustained heavy damage as telecommunications. The ship was attacked, but it was far from military vessels patrolling the Red Sea as operations. 24 hours. Once damage was already sustained, time drops out. The ship's The ship is now reported by some sources to have sunk, and we expect that there will be a definitive answer on its status by the time you see this episode. It's unclear whether the surviving crew members may still be on board, or even worse, whether another Houthi boarding operation could have taken place, with the crew members being taken hostage or even killed. Now, we should be very clear here and emphasize that due to the nature of our production schedule, this episode doesn't account for the couple of days immediately before it's published. As such, it is entirely possible that the Houthis will have attacked more ships by the time you see this episode, but for now, we're only able to discuss 2. But even just a pair of Houthi attacks in July of 2025 are global news for a very good reason. Not only are they the first successful Houthi strikes on Red Sea shipping in nearly 6 months after a partial ceasefire was agreed in the wake of a nearly 2-month ceasefire in Gaza. Even worse, the strikes show a clear escalation in technical and tactical ability for the Houthis and confirmation that they retain the ability to carry out complex attacks despite intense aerial bombardments by both Israel and the US coalition of nations under Operation Prosperity Guardian. Not only that, but the attacks on the Magic Seas and the Eternity Sea marked a clear shift in intent for the Houthis. This is an organization that has been targeting Red Sea shipping constantly since late 2023, but has only sunk 2 ships, captured 1, and killed only 4 crew members before these latest attacks. Now, in the span of just a couple of days, they've put 2 more ships beneath the waves and killed several more people. The Houthis typically don't commit nearly so many resources to a single target like they did with the Magic Seas, and for them to send 8 manned skiffs, 4 USVs, several missiles, several aerial drones to the same target before boarding the abandoned vessel and planting explosives represents a new level of dedication. As Martin Kelly, the head of marine security company RS3 Group, explained in the Financial Times, he meant to sink his ship. According to the Houthis, target Israel, organizations with ties to the country, something that the companies that own the 2 targeted ships didn't have. At least one of the ships, the Magic Seas, Israeli force of call, but the attack confirms long-held suspicions that Houthis targeted data out of date or simply fabricated in order to cover up, to attack targets indiscriminately. Already, global markets are responding, with insurance premiums spiking in the wake of the second attack. It will start to deter trade vessels from crossing the Magic Sea. Houthi territory sits along one of the world's most critical waterways, and ships that have to avoid the Red Sea can't access this canal, and take a much longer route around Africa and causes supply chain issues downstream across the globe. Insurance premiums had already spiked, and ships have already been rerouted to circumnavigate Africa during the Houthis' longer stretch of attacks from late 2023 to the end of 2024. But now, in the span of just 2 attacks, the Houthis have managed a number of sunk ships and the number of killed crew members from that entire previous campaign, some new tactics, weapons, and a new sense of determination to ensure that they sink whatever ships they attack. There's 1 or 2 more attacks like this in which Israel and Western coalition ships fail to stop another sinking or more death, and global markets will be forced to make drastic accommodations for the violence. For the Houthis, especially with their apparent ability to regularly build sea drones and use them in coordination with each other and other assets, is a major problem, and it's made worse by another series of reports in the last several weeks, with multiple reports drawing attention to the Houthis' formation of a new alliance. The partner in question is the Somali terror group Al-Shabaab, deep into a complex and ruinous alliance against the forces of the Somali federal government. According to news reports, the Houthis and Al-Shabaab have formed an alliance of conflicts working from opposite shores of one of the world's most important ports. The Houthis have started to supply Al-Shabaab with weapons, and not just small arms, but drones and possibly even guided missiles. In return, Al-Shabaab has started to lend the Houthis the support of its pilots, diversion from the direction of coalition naval patrols, so that Houthi smugglers can get into Yemen's ports. While the alliance appears to be most convenience, the 2 terror groups have nonetheless realized good success in their joint operations so far. Al-Shabaab appears to have already received sniper rifles and light machine guns from the Houthis, and both groups have integrated themselves into larger supply chains running from the Middle East to the East African coast. According to the United Nations, Al-Shabaab might even provide data to the Houthis with a third of Houthi attacks in the Gulf of Aden targeting ships that should have been Al-Shabaab fighters have also been found smuggling kamikaze drones that appear to have been of Houthi origin. At the same time, we're not going to be too deep into the recent reporting on this attacks today, although do let us know if you'd like us to cover it in the future. The more important point, in the light of the Houthis' most recent pair of attacks, is that the potential involvement of Al-Shabaab introduces a whole other layer of potential chaos and devastation. If the two groups decide to coordinate together, then the entire Upper Red Sea and much of the Gulf of Aden will range, forcing them to find alternate routes instead of just trying to hold the African coast and get out of the Houthi range. In the near term, it'll be on the rest of the world to figure out a response. The US-led coalition Operation Prosperity Guardian wasn't able to meaningfully defend either of these most recent assaults or intervene during an extended period of attack. Europe's defensive naval mission, Operation Aspides, hasn't been any more useful, and Israel's airstrikes after the hit on the Magic Seas were immediately followed by a deadly second attack carried out by the Houthis. If these more powerful nations can't act other than trade ships, then the Red Sea and just a bit of a story, I'll give a quick plug for our free Warfronts newsletter. Twice a week we deliver your inbox without any charge, so you can keep up to date on all the madness happening around the world right there in your inbox. Very easy. From Crimea to the Congo, we've got you covered. All you need to do, follow the link in the description to sign up. There is no catch, it's free, always will be. And now back to the Situation Room. And our second story, Ukraine attempts to build a presence in Africa. Russia, mercenaries, Africa. At this point in the 2020s, it's a well-worn story of an authoritarian regime on the African continent dealing with internal crises and wanting to consolidate their power agrees to a partnership with Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. Hundreds or even thousands of Russian-speaking mercenaries flood into the nation, providing protection to the new regime by way of battle-tested warriors who consider themselves beholden to no law. In exchange, those mercenaries oversee the establishment of vast resource extraction operations and begin siphoning away critical minerals, all for the benefit of Putin and Russia's oligarch class. But now, Russia's primary adversary in Eastern Europe is looking to take its fight to a new continent, extending a campaign of subterfuge and targeted grey zone warfare that's been building for quite a while. According to Ukraine's invasion to Africa, that seems to be, Kiev is looking to step up its engagement with multiple African nations in an effort to both build and strengthen its relations with the continent and to undermine a critical element of Russia's larger war effort. Timing is everything, and to understand the opportunity that Ukraine hopes to exploit in Africa, we first got to understand the cracks that have started to show in Russia's continental effort. Whilst the Kremlin and Russia's operations in Africa are going quite well, the nation has expanded its partnerships to include new African clients, and it's overhauling its security presence with the introduction of the Africa Corps, an organization that Russia can control much more easily than the Wagner Group. But, as we've covered in recent prior episodes of the Situation Room, the truth of the matter is a bit more complicated than Moscow would like to admit. Russian mercenaries have come under repeated attack across Africa, especially in the nation of Mali, and they've been less effective than either they or their host nations would hope on both a tactical and a strategic level when battling themselves. The Africa Corps is moving into former Wagner postings, but it's arriving at lower combat readiness with none of the local connections or situational knowledge that Wagner had spent years building. And right now, as sensitive handovers take place in nations like Mali, there's reason to believe that the Africa Corps of Wagner could be especially vulnerable, getting accustomed to the lands before they can truly settle things. So with that context, it's hardly a coincidence that Kiev has chosen this moment to get to Africa, and nor should it be a surprise that Kiev has directed its outreach to a nation with the unique potential to cause Russia even greater problems than it's already facing. That would be the vast and mostly deep desert nation of Mauritania. It's one of the poorest and most remote nations on Earth, a place where outright slavery still persists and where nomadic desert herdmen roam the landscape largely uninterrupted. But it also happens to share a border of over 2,000 kilometers or nearly 1,400 miles with the nation of Mali, where Central Africa Corps forces are only just completing a handover from the Wagner Group, and where Russian paramilitaries of all persuasion have come under attack from a pair of jihadist insurgencies, the Islamic State Sahel branch and the Al-Qaeda-linked group Janim. Mali and Mauritania have had a complicated relationship for many, many years, and that relationship has only gotten more strained since Russian mercenaries arrived in the area. In addition to their fight against local jihadists, Russian forces are adversaries of the Tuareg, a large and historically nomadic ethnic population that organize into separatist groups in Mali, but are entirely welcome in the open badlands of Mauritania. In recent years, Wagner forces have rampaged into Mauritanian territory in their pursuit of Tuareg militants, causing major diplomatic tensions between the two neighbor nations. Mauritania has become a home for nearly 250,000 Malian refugees who've fled both the asymmetric conflict in the nation and Mali's military government, while Mauritania regards Mali as an unstable nation that presents a real risk of jihadist violence spilling over the border in the long term. Mali, meanwhile, accuses Mauritania of mistreating migrants and harboring loyalties to the Western powers that Mali's military regime has worked to expel from the region. The two nations are not exactly about to go to war anytime soon. They have neither the fighting forces to do so, nor very much action to fight over. But for Ukraine, looking for a partner with an axe to grind against Russia and its client states, Mauritania is a very interesting option. And according to Kyiv, that's precisely what it intends to do. Mauritania has already opened up direct collaboration with Ukraine, working with Kyiv to ferry much-needed food aid to the same refugee camps that has displaced people from Mali. But now, Kyiv is working to secure an agreement for a military partnership with Mauritania in which it would collaborate to train Mauritanian soldiers and officers into fighting shape. Not only that, but Ukraine has offered technological partnerships to enhance the nation's fighting capability. Mauritania is the sort of place where the armed forces field a total of 50 post-World War II tanks, 4 prop-powered combat aircraft, and a navy that could maybe send 3 small patrol craft into the open water at any time. But it is a prime candidate to switch its military strategy toward the cheap, largely consumer-grade drone technology that Ukraine offers for surveillance, for kamikaze attacks, and a whole lot more, similar to how other small militaries or non-state actors have switched to using these methods. In short, Kyiv is providing to Mauritania what Russia is providing to Mali. And as Ukraine's actions would indicate, Mauritania isn't the only nation that can expect this sort of offer real soon. Ukraine's opened a total of 8 new embassies across Africa since the Russian invasion began in 2022, including the embassy in Mauritania. The nations that Ukraine has targeted are predominantly ones that either have interests and conflict with Russia's, or that have prior experience with Russia that's led them to believe Moscow is no better than the last generation of colonial powers trying to set up shop on the continent. Ukraine has zeroed in on the Democratic Republic of the Congo for another potential defense partnership like the one in Mauritania, noting the DRC's potential willingness to counter Russia when it's trying not to get overrun by rebels and to work in economic collaboration with the United States. And over the last several years, according to the European Policy Centre, Ukrainian grain shipments have provided food aid to over 8 million people across 12 vulnerable nations. On the one hand, expanding its partnerships in Africa would allow Ukraine to provide a stark international contrast to Russia, focusing on far more humanitarian assistance and coming with none of the atrocities and human rights abuses that Russian mercenaries do for. Ukraine's partnerships focus only minimally on resource extraction, at least for now, in a welcome break from the way not just Russia, but China and the United States approach the threat. And on the other hand, an enhanced presence across Africa, and especially a presence in nations that aren't friendly to Russia, provides Ukraine with an opportunity. By placing its own troops or paramilitary units on the continent, Ukraine can start taking the fight. Hampering the Russian war effort and forcing Moscow to divide its attention between its neighbour and a situation in the entire continent. On a tactical level, this is something that some time. In early 2024, video evidence established that forces were on the ground in Sudan, fighting alongside the nation's regime against the paramilitary rapid support forces, a known client of the Russian Wagner Group. Well before that evidence came out, Ukraine was suspected of helping Sudanese forces conduct kamikaze drone strikes, and legends were already circulating of pale-skinned snipers with an appetite for Russian mercenaries. Last summer, Ukraine was suspected of facilitating the battle of Tinzao-Den. Dozens of fighters were slaughtered in back-to-back ambushes in Mali, first by Tuareg rebels and then by the jihadists of Jenin. Ukraine has publicly denied any coordinating the ambushes, but since their conflict with rebels in Mali has shown an unusual appetite for drone warfare techniques, and often the drones themselves, that Ukraine has used in battle against Russia. Despite Ukraine's denials, the Mali was convinced thoroughly enough that it cut ties with the Russia, and in a strategic sense, there's good reason to believe that Ukraine's approach might be successful. Ukraine has already proved the value of attacks that subvert Russia's understanding of its own front lines. Its months-long occupation of Russian territory in the Kursk region, where Kiev forced Moscow to allocate tens of thousands of troops while being real pain and discontent from Russian residents. And by targeting Russian operations in Africa, Ukraine would be targeting the vast resource and financial networks Russia relies on in order to build its war. Russian military ability is built with the critical mineral resources that it extracts from Africa. Russia coffers housed by way of gold and other highly lucrative products it can source from the continent. Russia's ability to sustain its war effort this long and to make non-economic sacrifices to remain militarily viable have the direct repercussions on Russia's operations across Africa. Although Ukraine is struggling to muster resources and personnel to deliver a knockout blow to Russia's chin on the battlefield, it can use fewer resources and fewer personnel in a grey zone environment to slice the tendons out of Russia's teeth instead. By selling sharp information like maintaining Russia's paramilitary stronghold in the Central African Republic, Ukraine places itself in direct proximity to Russian forces abroad. Those forces have already been shown to struggle in battles against the conservative forces. They are considerably more vulnerable when they're up against Ukrainian special forces veterans who can operate highly asymmetrically with a light touch and with the tactical autonomy to fight their fight in their way. And there are other problems. Russian paramilitaries in Africa tend to be quite reactive or even sedentary attacks, operating across predictable routes and areas until they're attacked and forced to respond to a specific threat. They often seem to prefer to focus their wrath against unreasonable rather than track down jihadists or rebel hideouts, and while some of their troops are highly experienced, they do not appear to be receiving any encouragement from Moscow to proactively run their own small-scale war effort. That presents Ukraine with an ideal situation where it can empower its small units with the latitude to do as they see fit within Kiev's parameters, and where those small units can then use safe official bases in other sovereign nations as a launchpad for covert operations. For Ukraine to be able to pursue this sort of strategy at scale, it's going to require a substantial investment of resources from Kiev, but the investment required to send small, self-sufficient units abroad is nearly $1 billion to the investment needed to sustain. Ukraine has proven its high-risk, high-reward, and highly disruptive tactics like these. Any semblance of a foothold in the Sahel, asymmetric Ukrainian warfare might prove to be worth additional resources from Ukraine's allies. If Russia is willing to prop up its the continent, then there's something to be gained by Ukraine in targeting the streams of resources that Russia depends on. All that's left now is Ukraine to get started. And now let's head over to Georgia. In November 2024, protests erupted across the South Caucasus nation of Georgia. At that time, we published a video exploring the facts on the ground and all that was driving tens of thousands of Georgian citizens into the streets of the capital of Tbilisi to vehemently protest the political climate around them. Since then, the story has slipped down the news agenda, bigger protests in Serbia, and the constant Trump administration. But the story hasn't stopped for those who live it. For the Georgians who took to the streets, this is still their reality, this is still their fight. So, more than 6 months later, we thought we'd check in and see what, if anything, has changed. Well, in short, lots. But from an EU and Western perspective, not in a very positive way. So first to recap. The November protests were sparked by a highly controversial general election 1 month before, which saw the Georgian Green Party, led by eye-wateringly wealthy oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, triumph with 53%. The government then announced that it would suspend talks for EU accession. One time this people supporting multiple polls until at least 2028. The announcement was met with outrage, being seen as all the more egregious but for years, the government had begun to demonstrate signals of politics in Russia and democratic principle. Following the 2024 elections, Georgian nominated a former professional football player with no university education for the country's presidency, incumbent Salome Zurabishvili, a French-born pro-EU former diplomat. And all of this closely followed the introduction of two explosive pieces of legislation in 2023. One targeting so-called foreign agents in Georgia, and the other severely suppressing LGBT rights, which led to such severe outrage that many from the opposition have hoped it would spell the end of the government when election finally came. To keep the brief, full political context, do make sure you check out our video on that. For now, though, this is how things stood at the time of publication. The enormous street protests were still ongoing. Zurabishvili was refusing to leave the presidential office. In all, the situation in Georgia was as combustible as it has ever been since the 2008 war with Russia. And another severe question hung over the fact that the former president turned prisoner, Mikhail Saakashvili, a man under whom Georgia had entered the brief but brutal war. Saakashvili was arrested in 2021 on trumped-up charges of abuse of power, embezzlement and assault. Having been subject to his own, at least a brutal prison torture scandal which erupted during his second term as president in 2012, his fate received much coverage and criticism due to the physical deterioration that he has displayed behind bars. He was seen in leaked prison footage appearing not only shockingly frail, but also appeared to be undergoing some sort of severe mental episode, which some attributed to his severe mistreatment. Well, unfortunately, Saakashvili remains in prison as of July 2025. In fact, he was handed a further 4-year term by the government having illegally crossed the border when he returned to Georgia from Mexico. Calls for Saakashvili's release have consistently resounded from the European Union, the Council of Europe, as well as human rights groups like Amnesty International. But those who are to afford total time now stands at 12 years as of his initial arrest 4 years ago. The prospect of his release appears to have failed, as Georgian dreams further consolidates its power, and with international media coverage either fading away entirely since late 2024 or focusing instead on other theatres of the Georgian government's suppression. Zurabishvili, for her part, did leave office in the end, doing so on the 29th of December 2024 and making room for her disputed successor, Kamalashvili. That's the former football player who was widely seen as a puppet of his party leader, Ivanishvili. Zurabishvili nevertheless described her replacement as illegitimate and has devoted herself to lobbying European and other world leaders to sanction Georgian Dream and continue to support the anti-government movements. She remained in Georgia and established a new political office in the capital, repeating her aim to continue the struggle on behalf of the and the European Union has backed her claims, adopting a resolution in mid-February which describes Georgia as a, quote, state-captured, illegitimate Georgian regime. However, Zurabishvili's own popularity has always stood on her footing. After her initial rise to presidency in 2018, which was marred by allegations of vote buying, abuse of state resources, and ties to none other than Bidzina Ivashvili, she settled into a role with a trust of around 50%, didn't improve much thereafter, swinging from 23% in 2019 backward into 16% in 2020. Her approval rating did rise dramatically. The two controversial government leaders that year, climbing to 63% according to even after voted with eggs by protesters at the Helsinki airport on her return from the Munich Security Conference in February, there was a lot of her assailants were agents paid by the government to target her. Zurabishvili continues to maintain that by virtue of the dubiousness of her successor's election, that she remains de jure the rightful head of state in Georgia. In this regard, she receives Parliament, which in February declared her the only legitimate fresh round in Georgia and sanctions against the country's leadership, strongly condemning, quoting here, Russia's existing With that said, we should point out that the EU doesn't have a perfect track record back in the democratic process. Around the same time, a presidential election in the EU member state of Romania was annulled after far-right candidate Calin Georgescu won the first round, allegedly with Russian support. In this case, Brussels was happy to look the other way as Bucharest throughout the results. Obviously, situations aren't perfect parallels, but for a body trying to fight democratic backsliding in Georgia, it wasn't exactly a good look. Today, the opposition in Georgia faces multiple challenges. Zorobishvili has energetically continued her pressure campaign. At 73 years old, it is unclear if she would have the political stamina and leverage left to take the face of the Democratic Front, 20 years older than her successor, Kavalishvili, and 4 years older than Ivanishvili himself. But an even greater challenge has been posed to the demonstrators by a relentless campaign of brutal suppression carried out against them by the government. Soon after securing power, the government passed local amendments expanding detention periods from 15 to 60 days, criminalising protest actions, and dramatically increasing administrative fines. As a follow-up to the Foreign Agents Bill, the bank accounts of NGOs providing legal and financial aid to protesters were frozen, which was seen by observers as another systematic effort to choke support networks. Amnesty International also reported escalating gender-based repression, including police targeting of female protesters with insults, strip searches, and threats of sexual violence. Moreover, the crackdown on opposition figures has evolved with merciless abandon. At least 4 high-profile opposition leaders have received prison sentences on politically motivated charges, as have many other activists, jurors, and media figures. And what about the protests? Well, they've continued, used daily, throughout most of the time since the election. Protesters have displayed remarkable resilience given the spate of crackdowns and often brutal arrests led by violence has diminished, ranging from tens of thousands to several thousands or even just a few hundred. Remaining protesters have also been forced to wear face masks and other cloaking clothing to prevent severe reprisals. And with their leadership targeted, the opposition is now also deeply splintered, lacking a central figurehead behind which to rally their efforts. With the decline in scale of the protests, media coverage has also dropped, leading to a sort of tacit normalization of development in spite of the heavy-handed tactics used to quell dissent. What will be the fate of fallen leaders like Mikhail Saakashvili is also unknown. What is possible, however, is that we would share the fate of figures like Belarus's Sergei Tikhanovsky, being detained long enough that any remaining political potency will evaporate before being released as a lame duck no longer able to influence political proceedings in any great way, if he even survives his detention. That's not as sad as it is to say then. The situation does not look good for the basic citizens of this small country, and frankly, that's a tragedy. As a nation, polls suggest 77% of people would join the EU in a heartbeat. A nation that was in the recent past invaded by Russia, with Moscow still occupying a fifth of its territory. And yet it is also a nation being dragged ever closer to its former overlord. A country in which the government of one man can ignore the will of the population and transform a pro-Western land into a Russian satellite, seemingly unopposed. Georgia's story may still be ongoing, but 6 months on from the initial mass protests, the final chapter appears to be taking shape. A chapter where the most likely outcome may be a downbeat ending. Now for our final story, we welcome Togo, the small West African nation home to 9.5 million people. In June, while the world's attention was understandably focused on Iran and Israel over fears of World War III, the Togolese people took to the streets to protest against what they saw as a constitutional coup. They hit the streets twice, first on the 5th of June, which was swiftly and brutally suppressed by the government, and the second time from the 26th to the 28th. It is this second protest, lasting for 3 days, that in an ideal world would have captured the media's attention. On the morning of the 26th, the streets pulsed with a tension that had been building for years through repression, silence, and the erosion of people's voices. Thousands poured into the streets to denounce recent constitutional changes that entrenched Faag and Assimbi in power. A quintessential African strongman, Assimbi has ruled Togo since 2005, and his policies have heavily increased the economic burden on ordinary Togolese while enriching himself and those close to him. So, you could see why people may have been fed up to learn that he'd be sticking around even longer. But while the protesters' anger may have been understandable, that didn't change the government's response. By midday, the capital of Lomé had become a city under siege, not by protesters, but by its own security forces. Witnesses who spoke to Reuters described near-apocalyptic scenes, with the police using batons, tear gas, and live ammunition to disperse protesters. When the dust settled, 7 people were dead, scores injured, and an eerie calm had settled over the country. Beneath the surface, anger simmered. Security forces remained stationed at key intersections, and many feared that the storm was far from over. Now, protests are a rarity in Togo, not because it's a bastion of democracy where the people feel like they have a say in the government, but because they were outlawed. back in 2022. For the people to go to the streets twice and risk the ire of a government that international observers have termed, with magnificent understatement here, repressive, something had to have gone oh so very wrong. Now, to understand why the Togolese people took this risk, we have to explain a few key facts about the country. One, since gaining independence in 1960, Togo has functionally been ruled by two people. Gnassingbe Eyadema, who came to power after a 1967 coup and ruled for 38 years until his death in 2005, and his son Fa Gnassingbe, who assumed power in 2005 and has ruled since with an iron fist. And we use the word functionally because while Togo has had other leaders, none of them has had as much of an influence on Togo's history. Two, until very recently, Togo had a presidential system where the president was both head of state and head of government. Constitutionally, the president can only rule for 2 4-year terms, and that brings us to point number 3. On March the 25th, 2024, Togo adopted a new constitution that transformed its presidential system into a parliamentary one. The new constitution weakened the powers of the president, making it into a ceremonial role while simultaneously strengthening the powers of the prime minister and renaming the office the President of the Council of Ministers. Unlike the president, who is constitutionally term limited, the President of the Council of Ministers has no term limits, which was contentious. And that brings us to our fourth and final point. The new constitution was adopted just 1 month before Togo's parliamentary elections and about a year from the presidential elections. Under the new system, the President of the Council of Ministers is not elected by popular vote. Instead, they're chosen by Parliament. And speaking of Parliament, after the April elections, it was firmly under the control of the Union for the Republic, or UNIR, Fa Gnassingbe's party, which swept 108 of 113 seats. So essentially, Gnassingbe gets to stay in power not because the people voted for him, but because he's the leader of a party that holds an iron grip on Parliament. And under the new system, he could now theoretically rule indefinitely. It is this sleight of hand, this bait and switch from a presidential to a parliamentary system that triggered the fury that we saw on the streets. To many Togolese, the constitutional change was not about strengthening democracy, it was a velvet coup. Slick, legal, lethal. But to reduce the protest to just politics would be to miss the deeper rot here. The real fuel behind the flames is the economy, or rather, the lack of economy. Togo's GDP per capita hovers around $1,000, one of the lowest in the world. By contrast, even a poor Central American nation like Guatemala has a figure almost 6 times higher. Youth unemployment is rampant. In cities like Lome and Sakode, young people spend their days hustling for scraps, selling second-hand clothes, pushing wheelbarrows, running informal moto taxi services. The state has no answers, and the private sector is tiny. In a nation where 60% of the population is under the age of 25, this is simply a ticking time bomb. And then, on the 26th of June, well, the timer on that bomb hit 0. According to Al Jazeera, most of the protesters were under 25 and had never known another leader and had grown up with frequent blackouts, crumbling infrastructure, joblessness, and shrinking freedoms. Pap Kadillo, a Togolese journalist and essayist, described the protest by saying, "These young people are not simply protesting a new constitution. They are rejecting 58 years of political inheritance from father to son that has brought nothing but poverty, repression, and humiliation." End quote. The government's reaction was swift. Once the armed forces had sufficiently quelled any dissent, they went into damage control mode. A steep 12.5% electricity price hike, another source of rage, was quickly withdrawn. The activist singer, Amron, whose arrest days earlier had galvanized public anger, was discreetly released. But neither move stemmed the unrest. This might have been because while the government's right hand was making concessions, the left was slapping protesters across the face. In a statement after the protests, Gilbert Bouara, Minister of Public Service and a senior figure in UNIR, said, "These were not peaceful assemblies. These were attempts to disrupt public order." He went further, denying that the security forces had committed systematic abuses and insisted that, and we'll quote here, "if there were any excesses, they should be examined based on facts, not rumours." He added that the government remained open to dialogue, but only with, quote, "visible, structured interlocutors," not anonymous calls from abroad. The mention of abroad is important because it points to a belief among those in government that the protests were not organic, rather they were fueled by the Togolese diaspora. In a strongly worded statement, the government said influencers in the diaspora were using social media to spread disinformation and incite hatred, violence, incivility, and civil disobedience. This statement gave the government a pretext to clamp down on the internet and social media sites. According to NetBlocks, a digital rights organization that monitors and reports on internet access, social platforms. Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show that tries its best to take the edge off the looming apocalypse by narrating it all in a soothing British voice. I am your host, I Whisper, and this week we're tackling your questions ranging from whether World War III has already started, to whether Trump was right about Europe under the radar war, and why Iran's regime is still standing. Surprising, there's lots to unpack today. Some of it fun, some of it really rather dark. So let's jump into our first question from my lord, Juan the Jet Dryer 7580. All right then. Who writes, big ass question. Has World War III started? We just don't know it yet. Now, this is a question we see constantly in our comments section, especially over the last 9 months or so, and it's not that hard to see why, is it? Things are bad right now in so many places at once, and with a few notable exceptions, those bad situations don't seem as if they're really getting any better. But has World War III actually started? I mean, no, not yet, but that doesn't mean a larger process hasn't already begun. Wars, they don't happen in a vacuum, and the world wars of the 20th century were no exception to that. Both wars came at a time of rising international conflict: the Second Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Balkan Wars, the Moroccan crises, and a major period of geopolitical shifts in alliances before World War I, and the war in Manchuria, the expansion of the German Empire in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, and Italy's conflicts in Africa before World War II. It was a busy time, do you remember? Now, there is a strong argument right now that between Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, the Sahel, and so on and so forth, we're witnessing a similar period of heightened tensions and chaos that you'd expect to see before a world war kicks off. And while not every period like this in global history leads to a world war, we haven't yet seen a world war that wasn't preceded by something just like this. But as for whether this situation is a world war, no. To be blunt, the question underestimates just how catastrophically bad even a non-nuclear world war would be. It's a useful rhetorical device for the purposes of drawing attention to a period of genuinely worrying conflict escalation across the globe. But as bad as this situation is, it is important to remember that it can still get oh so much worse, and it can get oh so much worse by orders of magnitude. A conventional world war that truly harnesses the economic power of major war-ready nations and places those massive advanced militaries into direct conflict at large scale is already an exponentially more damaging situation than what we can observe right now. And if such a war involves a nuclear exchange, well, then there's another order of magnitude, isn't it? Now, look, we're not sure if that's optimistic exactly, but when we're discussing global conflicts, perspective does matter. The threshold for a global situation to count as world war is a lot higher than this, and rightfully so. Modern civilizations with modern weaponry have the capacity to ensure that we would remember the chaos today as the easy times. So that's scary, isn't it? Was Trump right about Europe? Next up, thank you to Derek Mitchell 2686. All right, who asks? Okay, so, well, I personally really don't agree with how it happened, him upending our long-held relations since World War II, insulting other nations, etc. Do you think Trump was in a weird way what Europe needed to hear to get serious about its own defense? All right, honestly, there wasn't even anything weird about it. Since this channel switched from history to current affairs content, which was a good decision for our views. Thank you, guys. The one drum we've consistently beating is the one marked "Get your together, Europe." Although, through a strange combination of inertia, fear of Russia, and a deluded sense that America would be our BFF and protector for all eternity, European leaders allowed crisis after crisis to come and go without ever saying, maybe now would be a good time to stop selling off our old military stock and slashing our defense budgets and, I don't know, start rearming maybe. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, come on. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 should have, at a bare minimum, killed projects like Nord Stream 2 stone dead. Russia's deployment of a chemical weapon on the streets of Salisbury in 2018 in the UK should have been final proof that the Kremlin cannot be trusted. And in a sane world, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 should have triggered a campaign of mass rearmament across the continent. And yet, through all of this, European leaders did what our continent does oh so well. They dithered, they talked, they held meetings about maybe holding some more meetings. Even initiatives that seemed impressive at first, such as the then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz announcing a special €100 billion fund to help rearm Germany, wound up under-delivering. In short, the continent just kept on sleepwalking on, unable to conceive that its holiday from history was, in fact, over. We were simply unable to believe that our European way of life might soon have to be defended with steel and gunpowder. Of course, there were European nations that took the threat seriously. Lonely voices like Poland and the Baltic states warning that we needed to boost defense spending to survive. But the biggest countries like France and Germany, kinda shamefully absent, guys. And then came Trump's re-election. The seeming pivot of the USA towards Russia, the humiliation of Zelensky in the White House, J.D. Vance's scornful remarks about the European armies that had sacrificed their sons fighting in America's Middle East wars. And make no mistake to Europeans like us, those moments were shocking, they were shameful. Like having someone you thought was a friend walk into your living room and take a on a photo of your family while also somehow kicking you repeatedly in the balls. But perhaps it was also what our continent needed to hear. Now let's be clear, Trump's return has united Europe in ways that even Putin's armies marauding across Ukraine could not. Had Kamala Harris won the election, there would not have been a pledge to hike NATO spending to 5% across the board. Germany would not now be embarking on a vast military build-up that will turn its army into the biggest in Europe. France would not be seriously talking about sharing its nuclear deterrent. So, to return to the question, the answer has to be yes. Depending on how you feel about him, Trump either gave Europe the tough love it needed for over a decade, or else acted so horrifically that it shattered any remaining illusions in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris that America would protect us. Either way, the result is the same. The biggest legacy of a president dedicated to making America great again may yet turn out to be transforming Europe into the superpower that it always should have been. All right, now let's go to Chris Meister, 1945. What country would be most likely to step into Yemen and try to squash the Houthis? What action would trigger the event? All right, well, unfortunately, it's a bit of a million-dollar question right now, isn't it? As the Houthis prove that they're not just willing to ramp up attacks again, but can use a wider range of tactics with greater efficacy than ever before. And that's after months of targeted airstrikes, primarily from the United States and Israel, that were supposed to diminish their ability to pose a threat. But there's a reason that no nation has gone further in intervening, so let's run through a quick process of elimination to account for all of the usual suspects. The United States, of course, has the manpower, the superior military hardware, and the logistical capacity to put boots on the ground in a full-scale Yemen intervention. But the nation clearly lacks the political will to actually pull the trigger, with a president who explicitly ran on the promise that future foreign interventions would be avoided. No European nation has the capacity to intervene by themselves, and the one with arguably the best resources, that's France, has recently been pushed out of foreign conflicts in Africa, where it has far deeper historical ties than it's ever had in Yemen. An intervention by Russia wouldn't just be real difficult to achieve given its preoccupation with Ukraine, but it would go directly against Russia's own geopolitical interests to intervene against an Iran-backed non-state actor. China is both strongly averse to foreign occupations and has few qualms about the Houthis, who have overseen the vital oil smuggling routes from Iran to China for years. Nor does any nation in the Middle East have the combination of will and capability to intervene Yemen directly. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have taken their shots and failed, with Saudi Arabia lacking the military capability to intervene in 2025, and the Emirates benefiting from a broader Middle Eastern chaos that the Houthis helped cultivate. Other powerful nations in the Arab world, like Egypt and Turkey, have their own problems at home and wouldn't want to deal with the domestic political consequences of the intervention. Israel is already keeping tabs on plenty of adversaries and has structured its military in a way that ensures a robust homeland defense at the expense of any real capability to engage in large-scale operations abroad. So, as for which country is most likely to directly intervene against the Houthis, well, really, none of them. If we had to pick one, though, it would probably be the United States, simply because the combination of operational capability and geopolitical will is slightly more favorable than any of the others, but even the most likely choice, still highly improbable. A coalition operation could have some chance of success, leveraging Emirati and Saudi ground troops in collaboration with Yemen's internationally recognized government, and perhaps with the large-scale involvement of mercenary PMCs in order to keep other nations' uniformed soldiers out of the fight. But although there were reports earlier this year of ongoing talks to this effect, those talks just didn't seem to lead anywhere if they happened at all. As for what it might take to actually prompt the international community to make an intervention happen, the decision may simply come down to relative cost. If Houthi attacks on the Red Sea become a regular occurrence again, especially if they're done with the same intensity we saw in these recent strikes, then Red Sea shipping will have to be protected somehow. But as costly as it is to reroute shipping around Africa in a world where the Red Sea becomes too risky, those costs may still be easier to bear than the cost of a years-long multinational intervention. As the Houthis have proven before, they are really capable fighters on their own territory, and any occupation of Yemen would have to be long and bloody in order to defeat them so extensively that they'd no longer pose a transnational threat. All right, let's move on to another question. Ian Hamilton 213 says, "Hi there, been a fan of the channel for 2 years now." Thank you, Ian. My question is, with everyone saying the Iranian regime is weak and there for the taking, why hasn't it fallen already? And will Western endorsement of an opposition help push it forward? All right, well, not all regime instability is created. And Iran is one case of a regime that's simultaneously pretty unstable, yet has learned to keep its balance just well enough to prevent it from toppling over. A big part of the reason why is the divided nature of Iran's opposition. The regime is widely disliked across much of the nation, but the rationale for people's dislike of the regime is dependent on ideology. Religious hardliners and hardcore nationalists are displeased with the regime because of the degree of difficulty it's experienced in fighting Israel, the nation's inability to overcome international sanctions and get through its economic malaise, and even perceptions that the ruling regime isn't hardline enough compared to what some of these more extreme factions would expect. On the other hand, there's the pro-democracy, anti-clerical and globalist opposition factors who would like to see Iran's hardliners fall from power so that Iran can peacefully reintegrate with the rest of the world. Those stances are quite diametrically opposed, and as a result, Iran's opposition doesn't have any sort of cohesive vision for the future or any single promise of an alternative. The Iranian regime does well at disrupting anything that might ever lead to the two sides finding common ground, and while there are circumstances that might unify the hardliners and the reformers against the regime, those are few and far between. An even larger bombing campaign from Israel could be one such scenario, hitting not just military and nuclear targets, but oil fields, economic targets, and civilian population centers indiscriminately. Or perhaps some sort of major scandal could implicate the Ayatollahs and other high-level regime officials in accusations that outrage both the hardliners and the reformers. That's in contrast to events like the death of Masha Amini in 2022, driving reformers into the streets but failing to stir up any real discontent among the hardliners. But information access is restricted, speech is sharply curtailed, and there are few, if any, ways to legally organize large-scale public resistance ahead of time. Any societal upheaval that's capable of bringing down the regime would need to come on so suddenly that instruments of state repression cannot react in time, and it would need to mobilize grassroots activists rapidly across the country's political divide. As for whether Western endorsement will help the regime fall, well, it probably would, but it would only have a limited effect. Again, if the Ayatollahs are going to fall because of a mass-organized resistance within Iran, that movement will have to bring together highly polarized factions around a common cause. For the West to openly and enthusiastically support a resistance movement may be immediately disqualifying for Iran's discontented hardliners, causing them to react with suspicion or hostility, even if the goals of a reformist uprising are in line with their own objectives. If we're talking about an exceptionally powerful movement from the reformists alone, or a potential military coup or covert Western support, well, that's a different story. But if it's a question of open support for regime change, the West can't help nearly as much as we in our Western bubble might believe. In the unlikely event that popular outrage could unify hardliners and the reformists against the regime, then the most productive thing for the global West to do might simply be to shut up and let it happen. Next up, Daniel N6700 says, the war in Sudan is a big deal most people don't know about. What's another war, etc., that's also quite a big deal, but also under the radar? Now, the interesting thing about this question is that you can define a big deal in a couple of ways, and how you define it does impact the type of war that might qualify as an answer here. For instance, we could try and look at conflicts that are affecting the lives of the greatest proportion of people in the nation. In that case, serious contender, of course, has to be Haiti's ongoing meltdown, where gang-imposed blockades of ports, roads, and airports have effectively plunged most of the country into a hunger crisis. The World Food Programme estimates that over half of all Haitians lack enough to eat, while over 10% of the population are currently homeless, displaced by the eye, water, and violence. But while this channel has long advocated for people to take Haiti's crisis more seriously, the sad truth is that it's only a big deal right now for Haitians themselves. In this, it's different from Sudan's civil war, which has managed to pull in a whole host of regional powers from UAE to Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Russia. So, if by a big deal we mean a conflict with a lot of geopolitical impact, we probably want to look elsewhere. For example, to Myanmar's collapsing ethnic states, not just because the fighting has provided cover for crime gangs to set up massive drug trafficking and online scamming operations, but also because of the ever-expanding role of China. Yet even this might have nothing compared to the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. The short 4-day war that the two fought earlier this year did make headlines around the world, but once the fighting stopped, attention in the West drifted away, despite the ever-present threat that it could reignite into a much more serious clash between nuclear-armed powers. India has still not reversed its suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, which spells existential trouble for Pakistan. For its part, Islamabad has tried to pin recent terror attacks on Pakistani soil on India, almost as if it's looking for an excuse to restart the fight. And finally, there are the conflicts that are currently low level, but have clear potential to accelerate into something oh so much more devastating. In this bucket, we'd put the ongoing conflict in the Sahel between the military juntas ruling Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso on the one hand, and a collection of separatist rebels and Islamist extremists on the other. Compared to Sudan, the death toll is still relatively limited in these conflicts, but with insurgent groups staging ever more spectacular attacks, the possibility is clearly there for whole nations to either fragment or to be overrun by terror groups. For the wider world, the threat is that these places would then become lawless safe havens for extremists from where mass casualty attacks targeting America and Europe could be planned and launched. Really though, the truth is that almost any conflict can become impactful at short notice. Back on April the 15th, 2023, almost no one predicted that the fighting in Khartoum would turn Sudan into one of the world's biggest catastrophes. And to our lasting embarrassment, we at War Fronts thought the conflict would be over so quickly that we didn't even bother to cover the outbreak. Sorry about that. In other words, what seems like a minor thing today could easily become tomorrow's crisis. For that reason, if for no other, it's always worth keeping at least one eye on the world's trouble spots, no matter how small or under the radar the fighting may be. Next up, Adam Green 8421 asks, there is a theory that the big three powers, USA, Russia, and China, are carving up the world between themselves. This would consolidate resources and power for each. Using your experience from monitoring conflicts around the world for a while now, do you see anything to support this trend? Things like the Belt and Road Initiative from China or heavy Russian presence in Africa, for example. Okay, so definitely there is something here. After all, it was only about 2 months ago that Donald Trump made headlines by implying and insinuating across a few appearances and public statements that he'd be open to precisely that sort of arrangement. Russia, China, and the United States each assert dominion over resources and parts of the world that are explicitly theirs and sort of lose their interest in part of the world where they are explicitly somebody else's. And certainly, you've hit on something with the initiatives that you've described, China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's expansion across Africa. Those are each clear examples of Russia and China attempting to build long-term geopolitical influence, secure stable and well-protected access to resources, and ice out major powers from those spots. What we would disagree with, however, is the neatness of the whole idea. While all three of these nations are in the process of snapping up as much value as they can, they're not going to do it in the traditional way, where we could neatly color smaller nations on a map based on where their ultimate loyalties lie. The world is far more interconnected than it's ever been. There's an entire digital domain to be considered. Borders are fluid, loyalties are for sale, and territorial conquest in most cases is just too messy to be justified. Instead of carving up the world into neat little sections, we'd expect a carving up process that's a hell of a lot more chaotic. It'll focus on capturing and securing a hold over supply chains rather than resource-rich nations. It'll focus on controlling and manipulating financial networks and guarding them with robust digital infrastructure rather than looting and plundering outright. It'll be a highly asymmetric process where it's entirely likely that, let's say, Russia and China could each hold complete dominion over their own piece of infrastructure somewhere in Africa, even though each of their infrastructure is a mere 10 kilometers away from the other in the same sovereign nation, with a ruler who thinks they're playing both Russia and China simultaneously. It's a dynamic built for grey zone conflict, and for that reason, it's a dynamic where none of the three nations has any actual desire to respect the carving up process, but where proxy governments, mercenary organizations, cyberspace operators, and financial tools are the primary weapons used by all sides as they chip away at each other's holdings. And just some food for thought here, consider accounting for the long-term changes in relative power between these three nations, because the balance of power between the three of them today isn't going to be the balance of power tomorrow. Russia, struggling with Ukraine overheating its economy and staring down a succession crisis when Putin eventually kicks the bucket, is pretty clearly in a process of decline, and nuclear arsenals notwithstanding, it's already the weakest of the three. China is very clearly a great power ascendant. The United States, well, you decide on that one, but there are arguments in either direction or an argument for stagnation. Each of these three major powers is going to be making decisions with their future selves in mind, and that leads to a very different set of priorities for each one. A nation that knows it'll be more powerful tomorrow than it is today will bide its time and try to keep things stable. A nation that knows it's getting weaker is going to try and do as much as it can right now on the assumption that it won't be able to do the same things in the future. And a nation that's either stagnating or can't really figure out where it is prone to acting erratically in hopes of shaking up the status quo and putting itself back into a more favorable position. All right, and now we'll move on to some more specific questions. And the first comes from Noodleman Supreme. Fantastic username. Do you find it hard titling your videos properly? It must be hard finding a line between titling something to make people want to watch it and show it's important without fear-mongering, World War III, or clickbaiting. How do you find the line, and how often do you think you get it right? Dude, this is a massive pain in the ass. There was a time not so long ago where we could put out videos on this channel with kind of neutral titles, and we'd still get loads of views. I mean, as of late last summer, we literally titled the video Burkina Faso, the world's most neglected war. And the algorithm kind of just serve it up to people interested in geopolitics, and then something just seemed to change. Don't know what, but it did. Videos with more balanced titles just started underperforming. It wasn't enough to just put out a good piece of analysis if we wanted people to watch it. Now, we actually had to think about a title, something screamingly good. And look, we agree with the implicit premise of this question. It sucks that everything on YouTube in 2025 does need to kind of look like clickbait. It sucks that a video called Sudan's Army Retakes Khartoum will get 7,000 views, while one title, The World's Worst War is Reaching Its Climax, will get 700,000. It sucks that the algorithm of people's viewing preferences created an endless need to make things seem ever more explosive and eye-catching. But we talked about this over here, and our feeling is this. So long as the scripts themselves aren't veering into fear-mongering or misinformation, doesn't really matter what the titles are. If we can use a over-the-top title to get someone to watch an otherwise balanced, informative video that will leave them wiser about the world, well, I mean, that's pretty good than no one watching the balanced video, isn't it? In short, it's difficult, and we wish we didn't have to be discussing where the line is literally every time. And look, we try to keep on the right side of it, but it is inevitable that we occasionally do fall down on the wrong side. We're sorry about that, but our guiding light is always going to be that the content must remain unbiased, or as unbiased as possible, and the information relative. So, how's that for an unsatisfactory answer? And our question from Piratemime that somehow manages to be both fun and also depressing. For your non-European audience, what is the one bit of Europe we should see before World War III plunges us all into a post-apocalypse? Oh no. We've all got different opinions about this on the team, so we thought we'd answer it in turn. Here's what our editor-in-chief Morris has to say. Although I should probably say Czech Republic, since the channel is based here. I'm going to go and recommend Slovenia, which is basically the perfect holiday destination. You've got a tiny, beautiful capital city, great hiking up in the mountains, a short stretch of coastline dotted with old Venetian-style towns, and cuisine that is a delicious fusion of Italian, Austrian, and Balkan flavors. Also, the tiny wine region is as beautiful as any part of Italy, but noticeably cheaper. In short, if the continent is doomed to becoming a radiated wasteland, this is the part to see before the mushroom clouds appear. Evan, regular contributor, says, I'm an American. Indeed he is, and have never lived in Europe, so I'm significantly less qualified to answer this. But as a visitor, I'd strongly recommend that everybody visits the city of Porto in Portugal at least once. It's a beautiful city, much more laid back than a place like Lisbon, and it's less of a place to go looking for tourist attractions than to book a relatively long stay and just breathe in for a while. Also, pastels de nata are very, very tasty. Indeed, they are, Evan. Good shout. And my answer, I went to Montenegro last year as part of a road trip. I drove kind of down south, and Montenegro, surprisingly beautiful. It was very beautiful. Just really a nice place to take a drive. Highly recommended. And also, before we continue, Matt Myers, 4832, led to slip that he's turning 21 today and that he'll be getting past the bars before getting some late-night conflicts information from us. Matt, did you bribe someone on the team to slip this in? We never do this. Shout out! Okay, after that little cheery break, let's answer another fun one before we go back to discussing the dark and depressing questions. Rosie Applemontat asks, I'm a mad scientist with a time machine and forcing you to go back to war. You can pick which war. I'm nice like that. Which one are you going to take part in, Simon? No, where to put you, which side are you fighting for? Oh my god, go back in time. I'm going to choose the... It's got to be Cold War.
So it doesn't count. No,
And I want to be on the side of the Allies. America. Yes, please. No serious war. I don't want to get a gun and have to go fight. Thank you very much. Hard pass. I'd much rather the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, I suppose. And here's another behind-the-scenes question from BRDD514. This time a little darker. What, because going back to fighting a war wasn't dark enough? What has been the hardest subject to cover, as in what's been the most difficult to research for a video, and what morally has been the most difficult? And we thought we'd answer this in turn. Morris says, in terms of hard to research, I've been wanting to do a video delving into the true death toll of the war in Sudan for about a year now, mostly because I suspect it's far worse than anyone imagines. But I've never managed to finish a script because there's just no solid information out there. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine did one acclaimed study, but it only looked into deaths in the Khartoum region alone, which makes it impossible to extrapolate across the rest of the country. Some major atrocities of the war, like the fall of El Janina and the subsequent mass killings, have been examined in depth, but in most cases, there's simply no research that we could draw on. As a result, published death tolls contain wildly different numbers. In the last major update in December, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project put the death toll at close to 29,000, which seems likely to be a vast undercount. The UN, meanwhile, estimated that around 40,000 had been killed. Back in May 2024, an American special envoy put the number closer to 150,000. The most pessimistic estimates suggest even this number may have now been exceeded many times over. In short, it's just impossible to say what the true death toll in Sudan is, and as such, we've never been able to release a video on the subject. Instead, we've simply tried to keep on informing people about the worst conflict that the world is ignoring, a conflict that deserves our attention as much as anything happening in the Ukraine or the Middle East. Evan says, the most difficult to research are any subjects located in places where reliable reporting is scarce or nearly non-existent. For example, there's an episode that I would love to write about the Wagner Group to do with control over the Central African Republic, but many of the most compelling questions we could ask just don't have answers available in the public domain. The same is true if we're talking about on-the-ground links between rebel groups and organized crime in Myanmar, the role of tribal leaders fighting Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the inner workings of life inside local militias fighting any of the other groups living in fighting where reporting is outright on the ground. A lot of secondary analysis is a starting point sometimes the information As for what's been the most morally difficult, I've never done a script as gut-wrenching as one. My sister channel Into the Shadows, that's another channel we do, check it out if you want to, back in 2023. That episode was on Saydnaya prison in Syria. Oh my god, I remember this episode. Sorry, this is Simon, not Evan. It just go watch it. It's horrific. Which was basically just a black hole at the time. It was suspected to be a torture center on par with Nazi death camps, which is now confirmed to have been an accurate assessment. With stories that are that dark and with so many victims who've experienced some of the worst horrors people can inflict on each other, I've always felt that we can't do justice to the topic unless we really plumb the depths as writers and producers and force ourselves to confront the worst of it. A fair number of accounts I read and heard from survivors of the prison made it into the final script, but there were just some things in there that I just couldn't include, partly because the video would have been taken down. Not necessarily taken down, this is Simon again, but definitely age restricted, so nobody is going to see it, and definitely demonetized. I mean, it was probably demonetized anyway. And partly because it felt like a bridge too far to decide on behalf of our viewers that they should have to listen to the most horrific details. People who wanted to hunt those details down absolutely could do that. We mentioned that in the episode, but they weren't something that we were comfortable putting in the final draft. And in a strange way, it's those details that I didn't exhale onto the page that have stuck with you the most, even multiple years after the fact. It doesn't ask for an answer, but I think not necessarily the morally the most complex, but one of the most interesting things I find about kind of the morals of this all, the number of people who on Twitter, for my sins, I still go on there, who will one day be calling me a Zionist and the next day telling me that I'm a terrorist supporter is really quite something. I think it's okay for there to be a war where there are two bad guys and the only good guys being all the civilians who end up dying. That requiem for my hair. So after that answer, a palate cleanser, Cheese McBurger asks, I'm genuine interest why Simon went bald. Dude, like a decade. No. 13 years ago, I went bald at 25. I know. World leader scrubs. And now another run from Pirate Mime, who sent us roughly 1 billion questions. As you cover all of this conflict, do you have any one world leader you'd want to sit down with and ask, what the f*** are you doing? And if so, who? Okay, who are Evan and Morris going to choose? Evan goes first. Xi Jinping. Good shout, Evan, without a doubt. There are a lot of world leaders whose actions are shocking, but basically boil down to the idea that if they hit their enemies with a hammer as hard as possible, as many times as possible, then eventually lots of their problems would disappear. But at least from an external perspective, Xi seems to be a master at playing the long game, and I'd want to ask him what the he's doing, and then sit back and listen to what was sure to be a very long answer. It would be fascinating to see how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together in Xi's own head, the master plan is imagined, and probably the parts of China's long-term goals and authority. Morris says Vladimir Putin. When Trump was re-elected, another good shout. The Kremlin was given the perfect chance to end the war on terms that would have greatly benefited Russia. That whole period back in spring, when the White House froze intelligence and weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and Trump suggested Zelensky was the only obstacle to peace, well, that was the moment for Putin to step forward and hash out a dirty deal with America, one that would have left Europe in shock and fallen far short of Putin's original war goals, but that would have still been good enough to sell as a victory at home. Had Putin agreed to a ceasefire and stopped the aerial attacks back in March, it's likely he could have walked away with American recognition of Crimea as Russian and an unspoken agreement that the parts of eastern Ukraine currently under occupation would likely never be returned to Kyiv. Nor would that have been all he got. Remember, at this point, Trump was talking about ending sanctions and welcoming Moscow back into the international community. There were discussions about America even participating with Russia to produce advanced AI, a deal that would have benefited Russia far more than it benefited the USA. Putin could have banked all of that and then spent the next 5 years rebuilding his army and undermining Ukraine, preparing to relaunch his invasion the moment Trump left office. And after 4 more years of uncertainty and economic pain, it's probable that Kyiv would have fallen. And to be clear, this would have been horrific for all of us. But from Putin's perspective, it would have been a perfect off-ramp with a clear victory and a plan for the future. And all he had to do was stop killing civilians, stop sending his own soldiers to their deaths for just a short while, but he couldn't. To paraphrase Black Sabbath, the war machine kept turning. I would honestly want to look this war pig right in the eye and ask him why he just couldn't take the win. For my answer, I'd have to say probably I would choose Xi from Evans, but seeing as Evan already chose Xi, I'd go for Netanyahu, but everyone knows what the fuck he's up to. Can Musk count? I know he's not really a world leader, but he's kind of on the edges of power, and I just feel for a man who is clearly very intelligent. He just makes endless blunders. I'd just like to ask you about why you can't stop making blunders, Elon Musk. Why? Why do you have to do this? Why do you have to be like this? And now, final question that makes us all smile, and I'll send on a less depressing note. Oakley X asks, I'm often cooking dinner when watching Warfronts videos. Hello there. Wonder what you're cooking today. What would Simon and the team want me to cook for them? Morris says it's got to be schmazak. Oh, that's very specific and very Czech. It's a deep fried to perfection and served with thick cut chips, what Americans call fries, and a side helping of tartar sauce, all washed down with half a litre of pivo, which is beer. Diabolical lace, great for the side. I think Morris there mentions what schmazak is. It's a deep fried cheese. I just had a schmazak with Morris. Not last night, but the night before. Evan says I'm always up to trying something new, and I enjoy learning more about people through the food they enjoy, and especially the food that's important to them. Oh, Evan, that's so open-minded. It's not going to be my answer. So I'd ask you to make your own favourite comfort food, however, you give yourself. I know. For me, ribeye, medium rare, preferably from South America. Definitely aged, bean-cut fries, or chips, if you're particularly British. Truffle sauce. Side with Brussels sprouts. Roasted Brussels sprouts. And that's it. Thanks for all your questions. We do one of these AMAs every quarter, so keep an eye out for our next community post. If you want to get our thoughts on something, it should be up sometime in October. Also, subscribe to our newsletter. I know you should. And it's free. Yes, completely free. Like this channel. Yes, please. Until then, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week for our regular coverage. Have a good one. Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show where, rather than fiddle as Rome burns, we instead despairingly narrate as flames slowly consume us all. Now, this week there are bushfires in Kenya, where Nairobi's weapons have embarrassingly turned up in the hands of genocidal paramilitaries, and there's smoke on the water for Taiwan as China experiments with ways to isolate the island. Finally, let's check in on Belarus, where the regime is making unsubtle overtures to the West. But first, we're taking a trip to North Korea, where Kim Jong-un's rapidly modernizing navy may pose a burning threat to us all. As always, timestamps below if you want to skip ahead, and just a quick piece of housekeeping that with our regular writers, Evan and Morris, currently exhausted from covering Iran all week, it's been a big one. Today's episode is written entirely by guest writers. Hello there! Let us know how they did in the comments. We think they did great. So, let's jump in and talk about North Korea. When the DPRK has previously been in the headlines for military aggression, it has almost always been regarding their missile programs, whether that's a new test they've conducted, a flyover of Japanese airspace, or belligerent threats made against their neighbor to the south. Kim Jong-un did, after all, earn himself the nickname of Little Rocket Man. But there's one part of the North Korean military that almost nobody outside the experts pays any attention to, and that's its navy. And with good reason. With much of its vessels dating back to mid-20th century designs from the Soviets and the Chinese, the fleet is dominated by just two aging Najing-class frigates from the 1970s, nearly 50-year-old hulls that are not exactly going to be winning any wars, alongside about 20 Romeo-class submarines acquired from China in the mid-1970s and then produced domestically until 1995. Now, at best, most consider the North Korean Navy a coastal defense force with limited ability to operate far from shore, keeping mainly within 50 kilometers of its coastline. And while its total of 780 vessels may sound impressive, most are small little patrol boats and fast attack craft that are decades past their prime and honestly barely seaworthy. But despite this, operating an aging fleet has not caused much of an issue for Pyongyang over the last several decades for the simple reason that their naval escapades have been pretty minimal. For the most part, the existence of the DPRK's navy has been defensive in nature, something they had on paper, but was not really taken too seriously. That is, until recently. Late last year, North Korea unveiled a newly constructed warship at the Nampo shipyard. Reported to be a destroyer featuring vertical launch systems and phased array radar technology, this was a far cry from the Stalin-age tankers floating around the shores of Pyongyang. In March, Kim Jong-un was photographed standing alongside his country's new nuclear-powered submarine, an enormous leap forward in terms of stealth and longevity during periods of conflict over diesel-powered ones. Now, last month, they were scheduled to boldly unveil yet another new 5,000-ton destroyer. However, this launch was abruptly delayed due to a classic bit of Pyongyang comedy when the boat only half deployed and then subsequently capsized. Despite the terrible PR, though, this move was more of a setback than a permanent roadblock. Just last week, Pyongyang claims to have fixed the vessel. While we at Warfronts cannot independently verify these claims, we're still waiting for our North Korean press passes. Here's hoping. There's a joke, I'm not going to North Korea, they would kill me. Maybe with one of those aircraft cannons. But they have at least managed to get the ship right side up. Regardless of how long repairs ultimately take, this is nevertheless a monumental shift in terms of both offensive and defensive capabilities that could mark a turning point in what has been a relatively, and we emphasize relatively, quiet decade from the North. The construction of such a vessel in and of itself should raise concerns that Pyongyang has begun to move away from its historic naval strategy of focusing on coastal defense in case of a land-based invasion, which often centers around small and nimble yet lightly armed vessels. These new Chohyeon-class destroyers are capable of projecting North Korean strength and influence throughout international maritime routes, which could cause a logistical nightmare for South Korea, Japan, and the United States. What's more concerning than international trade is the ability to launch missiles from this retrofitted naval force, which is an absolute game changer in case of a sustained conflict. Now, up until this point, the DPRK's missile program has been limited to land-based launch systems. While not impossible to hide, many of these locations are both easy to discover and cumbersome to relocate. Even those that are designed to be mobile have considerable logistical challenges transporting them, making them a more easily identifiable target. Sea-based systems would fix that. Inherently more elusive and mobile, Pyongyang would potentially be able to transport nuclear warheads around with the ability to launch off of the mainland. This is all the more true in the case of their nuclear-powered submarines, which are reportedly capable of launching submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs. The strategic implications here we really can't overstate. As a nuclear-powered submarine could stay submerged for extended periods of time and cover vast distances, this would give the North a significant leg up in hiding their nuclear arsenal. Given that a submarine could quickly surface and launch their missiles, Allied forces would already be behind by the time they detected it. What's more is that this would provide North Korea with what's called survivable second strike capability. Now, for those unfamiliar, this means that in the event of a preemptive attack that successfully eliminates all of the DPRK's land-based missile sites, they would still be able to retaliate with devastating effect. This capability, if achieved, essentially makes the North untouchable. Any action taken against them, even if legitimate, would be almost guaranteed to provoke a massive response. And all this begs the question of how such an isolated country, which is under some of the most strict international sanctions imaginable, would be able to achieve such progress. And the answer there is that they didn't, or at least they didn't alone. They had some help from their increasingly close relationship with Moscow. It has been well documented by this point that Pyongyang deployed a significant number of soldiers to Russia to assist their soldiers in the fight against Ukraine, which continues to bog the country down in war nearly 3.5 years on. Kiev is claiming that as many as 4,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed or wounded so far in the conflict, which points to a surprisingly large presence numbering somewhere between 10 to 14,000 soldiers. The conditions soldiers from the north find themselves in are reportedly extreme, lacking basic equipment and at times serving as human mine detectors. This has not been a one-way act of charity from Kim, though. As Moscow has increasingly found itself under international sanctions, it has found a friend along its short border on the Korean peninsula. President Vladimir Putin himself visited Pyongyang last summer, where the leaders vowed deeper ties with defense cooperation, although the exact details were not made public. Russia and North Korea may be known for many things, but transparency, it's not one of them. What we do know, however, is that this collaboration has yielded concrete results for the DPRK, and in far less time than many expected. Russia has donated at least one Panzer S-1 mobile air defense system, although given the recent performance of the S-300 in Iran, one has to wonder just how much of a gift this really is, along with a significant amount of sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. Russian officials have also been on the ground to assist in upgrading the guidance and targeting systems of North Korea's missiles. And then there's the naval aspect. So suddenly have the DPRK's craft advanced that you could be forgiven for thinking that they're practically Russian ships flying North Korean flags. And that's not an exaggeration. The four-faced phased array radar mounted on the Chohyun is similar in layout and installation angle to the radar systems deployed on Russia's Karakurt-class warships. The integrated air defense system, including vertical missile launchers, tracking radar, autocannons, and actuating shafts, bears an uncanny resemblance to Russia's Panzer system, suggesting it may be a replica. Far more concerning than questionable missile defense systems, though, is the lightning-fast progress Pyongyang has made on these vessels. The first Chohyun-class destroyer was launched in April 2025 and was in operation conducting weapons tests within days. Even with the botched launch of the second destroyer last month, it was largely repaired within weeks. This pace of development is unprecedented for North Korea's naval capabilities, and we have to be honest, it's impressive even by global standards. The first destroyer was reportedly built in just 400 days. That's roughly a quarter of the time the US has been taking to build destroyers, although the American ships have slightly more technology integrated into their construction. This isn't the work of a regime dabbling in naval modernization. This is a systematic overhaul of an entire military branch. And the bottom line here is really, really clear. What we're witnessing here is a fundamental strategic shift. North Korea is no longer content with coastal defense. They're rolling out a modernized advanced navy capable of holding their own alongside their Russian allies across the Pacific. Kim has already approved plans to build 2 more destroyers in 2026 and further work on expanding the program. In the United States, its allies, this represents a nuclear-armed North Korea with naval capabilities to not just project power on the seas, but to achieve survivable second strike capability. Where exactly the Kingdom's ambitions will take this program over the course of the next few years, that's not yet known. But what is known is that it will almost certainly keep defense analysts in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo Now, just before we continue, I do want to put in a quick plug for our fantastic twice-weekly newsletter. It keeps you up to date on everything that's going on. It keeps you up to date on the defense world. You'll find a link to it below. It is absolutely free. As I mentioned, it goes out twice a week. It's a good read. People give lots of feedback. This is really nice. So if you want something really nice, go check it out. It's the worst newsletter plug ever. Well, let's get back into the episode. Just before we continue with today's episode, a quick word from our fantastic sponsor, Make It Possible. Here's a fun experiment. Google your name, your city, put a little bit of your address in there, and the odds are that you'll find your personal data on sites that you've never visited. Web pages, business registries, Google databases. You can put it there, but they'll help you get that data. They send automated removal requests to over 250 databases. But also, now they're on limited plans, you can go even further. You found a random site exposing your internet, using that giant list of databases, or paste that link to the try to remove it, even if it's not one of those users. There are limits, social media, court records, but everything else, so take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code WARFRONTS at incogni.com/warfronts, and you'll get 60% off. All right, there's first time for everything. Your first word, your first love, your first prosecution of a Chinese captain for damaging critical underwater infrastructure. Now, as intelligent, well-informed Warfronts viewers, there's a good chance you've already heard about some of Taiwan's tribulations at the hands of China. You may have also heard about the controversies surrounding the damage being caused to undersea cable infrastructure. It has been a pretty hot topic, and it's been a hot topic for a good reason. On the 23rd of June 2025, Taiwan's Tainan District Court handed a 3-year prison term to a Chinese captain named Wang for cutting an undersea cable connecting Taiwan and the Pacific Islands. This incident occurred several months earlier. On the 22nd of February 2025, Wang's Togolese-flagged vessel, Hong-Tai 58, dropped anchor in a no-anchoring zone before drifting over a subsea cable and causing it to stop the process. For context, undersea cables are the fiber optic lines found on the ocean floor that form the backbone of the global internet. Capable of transmitting multiple terabits of data per second, they offer the fastest and most reliable method of data transfer. Up to 99% of intercontinental data transmission takes place through submarine cable systems, so in short, they're really important. Now, in the days leading up to the cable cut, the ship's movements were erratic, with tracking data revealing that it lingered in the area for a suspiciously long time. Although the Taiwanese authorities prosecutors were unable to prove intentional sabotage. Rising in China's reputation for dubious methods, many unsurprisingly suspect Beijing is responsible for the incident. Putting on its most adorable puppy dog eyes, Beijing denied involvement, dismissing it as oh my, it's a common maritime accident. It's been exaggerated by the Taiwanese authorities. We did nothing. We mention this not because the incident was in itself vitally important, but because it highlights a worrying trend: the rise in grey zone warfare. The deliberate sabotage of undersea cables in pursuit of strategic aims is a classic example of grey zone warfare. And fittingly, like the term itself, also quite helpful. Nevertheless, one 2021 blog published by the UK government did a decent job, defining it as being, quote, a murky area consisting of everything which isn't full-on conflict, but isn't exactly an open act either. Now, essentially, grey zone warfare provides countries with the means to impact one another without provoking a potentially devastating direct conflict. This is particularly useful if the adversary in question possesses nuclear weapons. After the February 2025 cable incident, the tab was picked up by Taiwan's Chunghwa Telecom, which invested about $576,000 US.
This YouTuber
Interestingly, just 1 month earlier, on the morning of January the 3rd, 2025, the Trans-Pacific Express, or TPE cable, which connects Taiwan to the US, Japan, South Korea, and China, was also damaged. On that occasion, Taiwanese authorities alleged that a Cameroon-registered Hong Kong-owned freighter named the Chongqing 39 was responsible. Although the cargo ship was intercepted by Taiwan's Coast Guard roughly 13 kilometers off the north coast of Taiwan, bad weather prevented the vessel from being boarded. Despite being requested to return for investigation, the ship was subsequently able to continue en route to a port in South Korea. Laying bare why any claims of accidental damage are difficult to entertain, Deputy Head of Taiwan's Digital Ministry, Herming Chue, told the Wall Street Journal, and we'll quote him here, "You need to accidentally drop your anchor on the cable, and then you need to accidentally turn on your engine with the anchor down, and even if you realize your anchor is down, you need to keep the engine moving until you cut the cable." Or in other words, you'd have to be a complete dullard to do such a thing unintentionally. These cases highlight the persistent maritime security threat posed by suspicious Chinese-linked vessels, as well as Taiwan's vulnerability concerning undersea cable infrastructure. And make no mistake, the risks from severed subsea infrastructure extend far beyond the ocean floor. Being in the digital age, taking such infrastructure offline causes significant economic losses, service disruptions, and threatens national security, all caused by just one little snip. Governments are a particular risk, along with telecommunications companies, financial institutions, tech giants, and other businesses reliant on global data transfer. The incidents also offer a window into how Beijing could isolate Taiwan in any future blockade or invasion. In the extremely unfortunate event of a conflict erupting between China and Taiwan, undersea cables would likely be among China's first targets. The island is connected to the outside world through 15 undersea cables. Cutting them could impact military communications, disrupt financial markets, compromise emergency services, and cause panic to spread among the public. This is not exactly ideal when you're trying to organize a military response. You probably won't be surprised to learn that China isn't the only one getting up to subsea skullduggery. You'll probably be even less surprised to learn that Russia's no stranger to such underhanded tactics. Because of course they aren't. A recent report published by the China Strategic Risks Institute analyzed 12 instances in which national authorities had investigated alleged undersea cable sabotage between January 2021 and April 2025. Of the 10 cases in which a suspect vessel was identified, 8 were linked to China or Russia through flag state registration or company ownership. The most unsettling part? With the involvement of Chinese vessels in breakages in Europe and Russian vessels near Taiwan, they're starting to look less like lone wolves and more like partners in crime, aren't they? With cables being cut left, right, and center, Taiwan doesn't stand alone as a country impacted by undersea cable sabotage. After a meeting in Helsinki in January 2025, Baltic NATO countries vowed to boost patrol missions after several telecom and power cables were severed in the Baltic Sea. Partnering with these countries and others that have been targeted or are at risk offers Taiwan a strategic path forward. In today's landscape, the old adage, "United we stand, divided we fall," isn't just a saying, it is a strategic imperative. Efforts could take aim at China and Russia's shadow fleets of deliberately concealed vessels that have struck an annoyingly effective balance between threatening undersea infrastructure and maintaining plausible deniability. Although estimates vary, several sources place the size of China's fleet at between 300 and 600 vessels, while Russia's shadow fleet is frequently reported to number around 600. As outlined by US Commander Timothy Boyle, writing for the Just Security Journal, quoting him, "Such a strategy should involve building a maritime security coalition, closing gaps in international law, leveraging information transparency, applying targeted diplomatic pressure, strengthening Taiwan's maritime defenses, and using legal tools as instruments of deterrence." Investment in monitoring capabilities also a worthwhile consideration. Given the high strategic importance and substantial economic costs linked to damaged cables, such investments are likely to prove both necessary and cost-effective. After the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines in September 2022, which highlighted the vulnerability of undersea infrastructure, the then Defence Secretary in the UK, Ben Wallace, accelerated the procurement of a new multi-role ocean surveillance capability ship to safeguard critical national infrastructure. In January 2023, reports also several outlets who the program to monitor large areas of the sea and vessels by global data. Tracking the movement of Russia's shadow fleet. In the same month, NATO initiated Operation Baltic, the deployment of aircraft, ships, and drones. However, as allocating so many assets is resource intensive, interest has been primarily in the use of uncrewed underwater vessels, problem is that while many countries search for technological solutions to the problem, China and Russia are likely to simultaneously work toward developing new methods to work around them. In March 2025, the China ships a new ship capable of cutting cable lines at depths of up to 4,000 meters under the guise of supporting marine resource development. Now, from a Taiwanese perspective, the red flags are unmistakable. While it remains to be seen exactly how the country will respond, surveillance and wire systems, digging these and burying the cables deeper, there is no shortage of available options. With the Chinese grow inaction or wrong isn't it could be fatal. After all, the battle for Taiwan could be just around the corner. Okay, so for our next story, we're going to head to Sudan, a common destination for the Situation Room, but this time, taking a detour to the east of the nation. Why the detour? Well, because according to the investigative outlet, Bellingcat and their partners at the Daily Nation, Kenyan crates close to the recently recaptured Sudanese capital, Khartoum. And that's a big deal, because the Rapid Support Forces are the ones battling Sudan's recognized military government. But, rather than plucky rebels, they're probably best described as bloodthirsty paramilitaries carrying out a genocide against Sudanese communities. So, Greater Kenyan police turn up in Cairo, kind of a big deal. In a shaky phone posted on X by the pro-SAF account Sudan Zero, SAF fighters can be seen inspecting an arms cache allegedly left behind in the RSF position. The post caught the attention of regional observers, including the investigative reporters, because some of the crates visible in the video contained clear markings indicating they were the property of the Kenyan government. By analysing that video, and many others, the reporters built a trail of forensic evidence proving that Kenyan weapons were in the hands of the RSF. Now, while we won't go into details of the investigative techniques they used, suffice it to say, we were really impressed. Instead, what we'd like to do is focus on what this means for the region, its reputation as a peacemaker, and any hopes of peace for Sudan. Now, it's no secret that various countries supplied arms to Sudan, according to Amnesty International. Sars al-Maz, Turkey's small arms manufacturer, is the supplier of the SAF, while the UAE allegedly supplies sophisticated Chinese weaponry to the RSF. However, before the Bellingcat though a UN Security Council report pointed out that Kenya was used as a transit hub for the RSF. Kenya's role has ostensibly been as a peacemaker. Nairobi chaired a subcommittee of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, that was tasked with creating an embassy in the war. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Commander-in-Chief of the Sudanese Army, rejected Kenya's chairmanship, claiming that President Ruto's alleged business dealings with the RSF leader Hemeti were introduced bias to the mediation. And General Burhan isn't the only one to accuse President Ruto of having business dealings with Hemeti. In April 2025, Rigathi Gachagua, Kenya's ousted deputy president, claimed that Ruto and Hemeti were working in tandem to trade Sudanese gold in exchange for weapons from the RSF. The situation was further complicated when, in early 2025, the Kenyan government hosted the RSF in Nairobi. During the meetings, the RSF signed the charter for the formation of a parallel government in Sudan, a move that obviously escalated regional tensions. Although Nairobi tried to frame it as an attempt to move this process forward, Khartoum wasn't. Sudan recalled its ambassador and banned all imports from Kenya in retaliation. The accusation of bias now feels less like typical diplomatic posturing and more like a grim I told you so. In light of the expose, past accusations, let's ask 7 questions. Now answering the first question. Salt is going to admit else than take the blame. Like Kenya's government to deny the Cat expose hit the airwaves. Government spokesperson Laura asserted to the fact that Nairobi had donated $2 million to aid Sudan's ongoing peace initiatives and possible affected by the conflict. News that shocked regional leaders. Dr. Morara directly refused to and the UN relationship with it's wonderful for us to today, we're just a YouTube channel reporting on organizations. But for a government spokesperson to say it in his official capacity, that's an unusual escalation. Sudan's administration the RSF and being in grave violation of international law and principles of good neighborliness. Away from the diplomatic mudslinging, let's try and answer the second question. What damage might this do to Kenya's carefully curated image as heralds of peace? For a long time now, Kenyan diplomats have sold their country as the regional Switzerland, the place where bitter enemies can sip tea, breathe the clean Rift Valley air, and put ink onto paper. In 2004, warring factions in Somalia gathered in Nairobi to agree to a deal that would form a federal parliament to end the bloody civil war that raged since 1990. Just a year later, Kenya led the Sudanese Comprehensive Peace Agreement, its framework to end the previous civil conflict and eventually paved the way for the founding of South Sudan in 2011. Furthermore, President Ruto has invested in his personal political capital to present himself as a reliable problem solver and stable partner to the West. He sent troops to Haiti, agreed to chair the IGAD Sudan subcommittee, and has been an outspoken advocate for peace in the region. Such branding is fragile. All it takes is a single crate, wrongly placed, to undo years of carefully staged photos of ministers shaking hands at peace tables. In a follow-up to the expose by the Amber open source investigative journalist of the Daily Nation, noted that international partners, such as the US, have voiced strong concerns, warning that Kenya's association with the RSF could jeopardize its diplomatic standing. When Washington agreed with the deployment of Kenyan officers to Haiti, it did so on the assumption that Nairobi was a net exporter of stability. As weapons being fitted on Sudan, forces the US to re-examine its approach to establishing that America recently sanctioned Hemeti for genocide. Washington had previously hinted at the possibility of sanctions or the withdrawal of key development and security assistance should Nairobi continue supporting the RSF. The African Union took a similar position, warning that Kenya's link with the RSF risked inside Kenya. The general public, already antagonistic to President Ruto's government because of past unpopular decisions, saw this as yet another instance of the regime putting personal self-interest before the country's interests. One Twitter user went so far as to the State House in Nairobi and public dissatisfaction with President Ruto's government so high that it recently galvanized nationwide protest. While we can't be sure just how much this expose will hurt Kenya's plans for peace up, what we are sure of is that the international community is watching and they're not going to forget this. Kenya's diplomatic position suffers, we will look back with the benefit of hindsight and say that this is the moment the downturn started. And finally, we need to answer our this mean for Sudan? For General Byrne, the expose affirms his long-held belief that Kenya may contact as a neutral mediator. The only way out of this conflict is through the total destruction of RSF. For Hemeti, the benefit of he remains well-funded with a network of international allies and seems more concerned with reversing the engagements that the SAF has made in recent months. Despite these gains, the war remains at a strategic stalemate, according to Alex Wall, an analyst writing for the BBC. In his assessment, each side is a new offensive, a new delivery of weapons, a new political alliance, but neither can gain a decisive advantage. If there are no clear winners in Sudan, while there are absolute losers, Sudanese civilians caught in the crossfire for whom the provenance of bullets matters less than the fact that the bullets keep flying. According to the most conservative estimates, more than 60,000 people have died in the Khartoum state alone since the start. We chose to highlight Khartoum state specifically because that is where the main weapons were found and most likely had the greatest impact. Khartoum is only one piece of a war that now stretches across the entire breadth of Sudan. Although the true death toll is unknown, most observers accept an American ballpark figure of 150,000 killed. What the people of Sudan need is for countries like Kenya to stop arming the belligerents and push for a lasting peace. We believe that crisis groups said it best, and will end by quoting them. In order to reach a ceasefire and find a way out of the conflict, the outside actors with the biggest stakes in Sudan's civil war will need to exert greater pressure on their Sudanese allies to choose a path to peace. We can only pray these outside actors finally take responsibility. On June the 21st, a tall man emerged from a transport van in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. He was met by calls scattered chorus. This was Sergei Tikhonovsky, a Belarusian blogger and political activist who'd been for 5 years before by the governments of authoritarian leaders under Lukashenko. Tikhonovsky sauntered forward into the embrace of a woman standing before him, his wife, Anna, considered by many to be the president of Belarus. It was their first meeting in more than 5 years. Tikhonovsky's release was met not only by the visible joy of his wife and supporters, but also by the surprise of many observers and figures from the Belarusian opposition. You see, his sentence, while decried by many as a travesty of justice, had been no trifling matter. He was arrested amid protests against Lukashenko's regime in May 2020, and after a detention lasting no less than 19 months, he was finally tried and convicted on several charges, including organizing riots against the government. In December 2021, Belarusian court sentenced Tikhonovsky to a term of 18 years in prison. So, what's the context of his early release then? Well, Sergei Tikhonovsky rose to prominence as a critic of Lukashenko, a strongman of Belarusian politics who has single-handedly run Belarus since the mid-1990s. At that time, the state was enduring a period of extreme hardship following the collapse of the Soviet system, and what Lukashenko appeared to offer was a reprieve and a return to normality. His platform, ahead of the country's first post-independence presidential elections in 1994, offered a nostalgic take on communism and was further polished by the promise of close ties with neighboring Russia. Lukashenko ultimately romped to victory in the election, finishing with 80% of the vote, far ahead of the second-place candidate who revealed little other than Belarus as Lukashenko slowly moved to isolate any potential rivals. Of what was a brain hemorrhage, others were forced into exile. The system began to evaporate entirely. By 2010, Reporters Without Borders ranked Belarus 154th out of 178 countries in its annual Press Freedom Index. The following year, Freedom House scored Belarus a miserable 93 on a scale from 10, mostly free, to 99, least free, in its own annual Freedom of the Press report. Streams of migration flowed steadily out of the country to the extent that the country's population in 2023 was thought to be a full 1 million people fewer than it had been in 1994 when Lukashenko took office, when it stood at its peak of 10.2 million. Its economy also tanked, and by 2025 Belarus sat at 39th Europe in GDP per capita, one place below Bulgaria, and marginally above Montenegro, according to figures published by the International Monetary Fund. Belarus remains the only country in Europe to carry out the death penalty. Opposition to Lukashenko's rule has been stabbed. Prison sentences all happening since his initial electoral triumph. Unsurprisingly, Lukashenko consolidated his power throughout all the intervening years, winning re-election in 2001, 2006, 2010, 2015, and most recently in 2020, with each one decried as illegitimate by observers. The Belarusian president has been dubbed Europe's last dictator by the Western press, a title which ironically Lukashenko has even referred to himself by, while confusingly also claiming that there is no dictatorship in Belarus. But no man or system can last forever. By 2020, Lukashenko, then in his 60s, was aging. And amidst an appalling state response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the Belarusian opposition thought they had a chance. So, in May 2020, massive pro-democracy protests erupted in Minsk and other cities against Lukashenko's rule. And central to the proceedings was a man who'd gained prominence on YouTube for his criticisms of the dictatorship. And that man, of course, was Sergei Tikhonovsky. Tikhonovsky grew up in Gomel, southeastern Belarus, and began his career as a nightclub owner and a concert promoter. In 2019, on the eve of the pandemic, he began the YouTube channel Country for Life, focused on his channel rose popularity, accruing more than 3,000 subscribers by the relentless popularity support, but also caught the eye administration and popular bloggers found himself in the government's sights. Then he made a move. On the 7th of May 2020, he announced on his YouTube channel that he would compete for the presidency of Belarus against Lukashenko in the upcoming election, scheduled for that year. By the time the video was released, Tikhanovsky was already in prison. He was arrested on May the 6th in the city of Mogilev. His friends had been unable to register to the Electoral Commission to stand for the election. And so, on the 14th of July, his wife, Svetlana, stood as a candidate instead. As the election neared and the momentum grew, Sergei's detention was extended further and further. Despite calls for his release by international humanitarian organizations and his wife, he remained in prison beyond the August election, and by which time the protests had been brutally suppressed. In the election itself, Lukashenko was controversially declared the winner with 81% of the vote against Tikhanovskaya's 10%, suspiciously an almost direct repeat of Lukashenko's triumph in 1994. And despite the outrage of the EU and election observers, Lukashenko claimed the presidency in his successive term. The day after the election results, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya immediately fled abroad to Lithuania, while Sergei Tikhanovsky continued to languish in prison. During that time, he reportedly suffered severe restrictions. According to Amnesty International, he was not allowed family visits or telephone calls, nor to meet privately with his lawyer or send and receive letters. He was deprived of warm clothing and once spent 40 days in a punishment isolation cell under frosty conditions. Tikhanovsky later described his detention as inhuman and a nightmare. He wasn't the only one. Also arrested were several close allies, supporters, and other members of the opposition. Viktor Babarika, another would-be candidate in the 2020 election, was arrested not long after Tikhanovsky. Babarika was statistically leading the independent polls ahead of the election, but was handed a 14-year prison sentence for bribery and tax evasion in early 2021. He was reportedly the subject of severe injury at the hands of prison staff in April 2023. He has not been seen since. Maria Kaslesnikava, a prominent flautist and political activist, was arrested in September 2020 and has similarly not been heard from since 2021. Multiple reports. So why has Tikhanovsky released? Well, his release to 13 other political prisoners Kellogg and Lukashenko in Minsk. According to Artyom Shrayin, Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, the unexpected move may be a concession to the Trump administration choosing to engage with Belarus. Franak Varkorka, an advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, added his belief that Lukashenko is in a frail political position and that he will attempt to improve his relationship, whereas possibly with an eye towards reducing some of the sanctions. But the other reason may be more simple, that the Tikhanovskys are simply no longer a threat. Like a victory or not, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's would-be term in office expired in January following the most recent presidential election, which was utterly dominated by Lukashenko, who got almost 87% of the vote. Of course he did. With his term secured for a 7th time in a further 5 years, Lukashenko had little reason to concern himself. Both now resign. Other prominent figures, including another of Lukashenko's rivals for the 1990s as such, the Tikhanovskys With his power now resecured, it allows him further time to continue his dictatorship and possibly to groom others to continue his legacy once it finally concludes, not least his sons Viktor, Dmitry, and Nikolai, now 49, 45, and 18 years old respectively. They've each received prominent roles in the government in recent years. Only time's gonna tell how all of this plays out. Thank you for watching. An ongoing military standoff, nuclear proliferation on your doorstep, a great power tussle between the world's two largest economies, and domestic political gridlock. The challenges facing South Korea are enough to make any policymaker turn red. Despite this, Seoul's ability to adapt to its nightmarish situation has long been impressive. The very fact that nuclear Armageddon at the hands of their northern neighbors. The signs are that in today's turbulent age, Korea's room for maneuver is starting to narrow. As the domestic, regional, and global situation deteriorates, the odds are stacking up increasingly unfavorably, and that could prove to be a disaster for the entire world. Both Koreas boast formidable militaries and are backed by self-interested superpowers. Throw into the mix political instability and weak leadership at home, and the stage is set for things to turn ugly. When things heat up on the Korean Peninsula, everyone should be worried. Sadly, the temperature could soon rise all the way to that of a nuclear inferno. We all like to think that we are well informed, but if your news diet only includes a couple of mainstream outlets, odds are that you're not seeing the full picture, you're just seeing a picture. Take the recent Israeli missile strike on a hospital in Gaza. US outlets mostly framed it around Israeli defense operations and noted patients' values. Meanwhile, headlines from Al Jazeera and local Palestinian sources led with the humanitarian impact, overcrowded wards, civilians fleeing, the loss of a vital medical facility. It's the same event, but what's prioritized changes everything. Today's sponsor Ground News doesn't just show you both sides, it lays them out side by side. Their bias ratings tell you which way left or right. Plus, there's the blind spot feed, that's where you can find stories that are on one side of the spectrum discussion. I just grabbed stories like the one easy to misunderstand if you're only seeing it. It's a great, eye-opening experience, and I'd recommend you try it too. Go to ground.news/warfronts to try it. You'll get 40% off, unlimited access to Advantage, and you'll start seeing a great power. It's not easy. Unfortunately, the government in Seoul, sitting precariously at with Washington and Beijing breathing down your neck, charting the best course of action, delicate balancing act. Watching this channel, where currently locking horns in a hut, forcing other countries to just stride. As a strategically located middle power with one foot in each camp, that means awkward times for South Korea. Given their shared history, South Korea Beijing threatens to make life difficult if Seoul is too far from neutrality. For Seoul, it's a bit like being in a 2022 article, cited 4 fronts in this rivalry, stating that, quote, Washington has been pressing Seoul to endorse its Indo-Pacific strategy and participate in related military activities, to join in trade, China's challenges, and to support America's campaign to criticize Beijing's violations. As the great power tug-of-war intensifies, South Korean policymakers must confront institutions see this just by glancing at the proportion of superpower NATO. While South Korea is generally aligned with the United States' strategy to counter the government hasn't exactly been strong This remains the case even after Yoon Suk-yeol assumed the presidency in May of 2022 with a greater emphasis on his US alignment compared with his predecessor Moon Jae-in. For example, after a trilateral agreement was struck at the 2023 Seoul has published information on joint military exercises with the United States and Japan. However, despite being an ally of Australia, Seoul has not pursued membership in AUKUS, given this specifically such a move would likely Seoul is concerned Islands likely recognizing that this would be Beijing's ultimate red line. Now, turning our attention to the second point, you're likely familiar with the phrase, money makes the world go round. Considering the trade war is still the US-China confrontation, there is strong evidence to suggest that this is the case. Now in its seventh year, Japan remains a ending cycle of escalating difficult measures aimed at for 7 years. Well, the trade war between your two largest customers is never going to be ideal. With exports valued at $133 billion, China was South Korea's largest foreign market in 2024, closely followed by the United States at $128 billion. China has already demonstrated its preparedness to weaponize its deployment of a US terminal high-altitude area THAAD missile defense system based on, quote, launched an aggressive public campaign of economic retaliation. As one representative from the US-China Economic and Safety Review noted, this included blocking market access for South Korean goods and services in the entertainment, consumer products, and tourism sectors, as well as authorizing cyber attacks on South Korean companies. Needless to say, this was not a fun time for Seoul. Nor was it even a fraction of the full weight of economic measure that China could potentially unleash. The warning there was clear as day. Now, moving on to the technological front, the recent wake-up call following the emergence of DeepSeek, aka China's answer to ChatGPT, and the country's access to advanced tech, encapsulates the fears surrounding this domain. It's no coincidence countries or companies trying to comply with the US in good faith, there should be some kind of carrots. In other words, if you want us to join you, bring something to the table first. Don't just beat us around the face with a plank of wood like a misbehaving donkey. And lastly, with Western values such as democracy and human rights at odds with China's authoritarian structure and human rights abuses, Chung In-moon highlights from suppressing leaders and anti-racist, quashing democracy, persecuting Yet despite sharing more ideological footing with the United States, pragmatism has resulted in Seoul very approach to China's transgressions. Just take Hong Kong. 2019. Of wildfire across Hong Kong in response to the expeditions in China. In South Korea, student protests in support of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement proliferated across university campuses, resulting in clashes between Korean and Chinese students. Walking into the wishy-washy, you could your Hyundai. Quoting here, Hong Kong is an important region that has a close relationship with South Korea in terms of people-to-people intelligence. We see it as important for prosperity and development in Hong Kong. In other words, I'm making this statement as bold as we can to avoid anybody off. Seoul once again found itself in difficult after Beijing enacted the 2020 National Security Law to establish democracy in Hong Kong. The US State Department invited South Korean diplomats to Washington to explain their position and galvanize international backing against China. To nobody's surprise, South Korea's response was muted to the point of Seoul tends to focus on maintaining the status quo, avoiding any stance that might make one of its partners mad. Analysts refer to this strategy as strategic ambiguity. As one of the China Then, Donald Trump entered the room. Returning to the White House with the grace and glory of an orange bull, China shone. Trump's second term has already seen many alliances, one thought to be armed hard, expressed carrots. But as long as Donald Trump is behind the wheel, there is only one thing that he should be worried about, and that's the stick. Vice President speech at the Munich Security Conference sparked uproar after he queried the United States' South Korea checking China. But there's a new sheriff in town, and as one 2025 commentary from Chatham House points out, again, unlike Biden, Trump views alliances as dependencies to be exploited by extracting maximum benefits to suit his America First agenda. So, what are the implications of this foreign policy change for South Korea? Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that the answer can be summed up as not good. Democracy in the age of Trump. Now, to understand the effect of Trump's return and what it could have on Seoul, it's worth casting our minds back to his first administration. Now, back then, Trump crowed about using South Korea's strategic vulnerability and the US military's presence in the country as leverage to extort concessions. That leverage is extremely significant. Approximately 28,500 US military personnel are currently stationed across several military bases in South Korea. Previous presidents viewed this as a pertinent measure to deter North Korea and, in doing so, protect US foreign policy interests. Trump has taken a different line by instead complaining regularly about Seoul's financial contributions toward hosting US troops and even threatening to withdraw or redeploy them. Despite Trump demanding $5 billion annually from Seoul in 2019, that's more than 5 times what was being paid, the pair ultimately agreed to a one-year deal that raised South Korea's contributions by 8.2% to $930 million. Not one to let good facts get in the way of a good story, though. Trump later claimed on his social media platform, the ironically named Truth Social, that, quote, "I had a deal for a full payment to us, billions." And Biden gave it away. Such a shame. In fact, under Biden, a 6-year agreement was reached in 2021, which saw South Korea agree to pay 13.9% more for the next 6 years. Don't be surprised, though, if Trump reopens this wound. In an April 2024 interview with Time magazine, Trump expressed